The train door slammed shut behind her with such finality that Claire Dawson's breath caught in her chest. Snow swirled across the empty platform like hungry ghosts as the station master bolted the depot door, leaving her alone in the howling Dakota blizzard with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a telegram from a groom who never came. The wind screamed through her thin coat, death itself reaching for her bones, when two small figures emerged from the white darkness. Children, half frozen and impossibly calm, with eyes that had already seen too much winter. "Our papa needs a wife," the girl said simply, as though collecting abandoned women from train platforms was just another chore. "And we need a mama. Will you come?" In that moment, between the locked depot and the killing cold, Claire understood that survival sometimes wears the face of a stranger's children and asks you to choose. Freeze alone with your pride, or follow two small hands into the complete unknown. Before we begin this journey together, I invite you to stay with Claire's story until the very end. When you finish, please comment below with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these frontier tales travel, connecting hearts across the miles. Now, let's step into that blizzard and discover what awaits at the Holloway farm. The wind hit Claire like a fist the moment she stepped off the train, stealing the air from her lungs and sending her carefully pinned hat tumbling across the platform into the swirling white void. She grabbed for it instinctively, her gloved fingers closing on nothing but bitter cold air, and in that small loss she felt the larger truth settle over her like ice. Charles Whitmore wasn't coming. The platform was empty. The other passengers had already scattered into waiting wagons and warm arms, their laughter and relieved voices swallowed by the storm. Claire stood alone with her single carpet bag, watching the train's red lantern disappear into the blizzard, taking with it her last connection to everything she'd known. Her hands shook as she pulled the telegram from her coat pocket, though she'd already memorized every word. "Arrive December 18th. Will meet train. Charles Whitmore." The paper trembled in the wind, the ink already beginning to blur from the snow that found its way into every crease and corner. December 18th. Today. She'd sold everything she owned in Philadelphia, burned every bridge, traveled 4 days across frozen wasteland to a town she'd never heard of, all on the strength of 12 words and a promise. The wind mocked her for that faith now, howling through the empty depot like laughter. "Depot's closing, miss." The station master appeared at her elbow, a grizzled man with ice in his beard and sympathy in his eyes that somehow made everything worse. "Can't keep it open in weather like this. Storm's getting meaner." Claire turned to face the small building behind her, its windows already dark, the warm yellow lamplight being extinguished even as she watched. "I'm waiting for someone. Charles Whitmore. He was supposed to meet this train." The man's expression shifted, something uncomfortable crossing his weathered face. He looked away, out into the storm, then back at her with the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. "Whitmore left town 3 weeks back, took the railroad job in Cheyenne. Didn't say nothing about expecting anyone." The words hit her harder than the wind. 3 weeks. He'd been gone 3 weeks, and the telegram she'd answered was dated barely 2 months ago. Claire's mind raced through the implications, each one colder than the last. He'd changed his mind. Or perhaps he'd never meant it at all. Maybe he'd sent letters to a dozen women, choosing the first who agreed, forgetting the others he'd left waiting. The reasons didn't matter. The result was the same. "Is there a hotel in town?" Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too steady, too calm, as though this were happening to someone else. "Nothing fit for a lady traveling alone." The station master shifted his weight, clearly eager to be inside, away from the cold and away from her mounting disaster. "Boarding house is full up. Winter brings folks in from the far homesteads. Your best chance is the morning train back east. Comes through at 8 if the tracks are clear." "And until then?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. A woman alone, abandoned, becoming someone else's problem. The depot versus the storm. Responsibility versus the warm fire waiting in his own home. "I can't let you stay in the depot, miss. Regulations. But there's a lean-to behind the feed store that blocks some wind. I'm sorry." He was already backing toward the depot door, already leaving her. Claire wanted to argue, to demand basic human decency, but she could see the door closing in his eyes before it closed, in fact. The latch clicked home with a sound like a coffin lid, and then she was truly alone on the platform, with night coming fast and the temperature dropping with every breath that frosted white in front of her face. The lean-to. She could survive one night in a lean-to. She'd survived worse. Her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and her feet were already losing feeling despite her sturdy boots. Claire picked up her carpet bag, its weight suddenly enormous, and turned toward the dim shapes of town barely visible through the snow. She'd taken 3 steps when she heard it. "Miss? Excuse me, miss?" The voice was young, female, and impossibly calm given the circumstances. Claire spun, her heart lurching with wild hope. Someone had come for her after all. There'd been some mistake, some explanation, but what she saw stopped her cold. 2 children stood on the platform, materializing from the storm like small ghosts. A girl of perhaps 9 or 10, thin as a rail but standing straight as a soldier, her blonde hair whipping from beneath a threadbare knitted cap. And beside her, a boy who couldn't be more than 5, his hand clasped tight in his sister's, his face red from cold and something else. Crying, Claire realized. He'd been crying. "Are you the mail-order bride?" the girl asked, her voice carrying a strange adult quality, as though she'd grown used to handling matters well beyond her years. Claire stared at them, her mind struggling to process this new impossibility. They were alone on a train platform in a killing blizzard, 2 children who should be home by a fire, who should be anywhere but here. Yes, I was supposed to meet someone, but he's not." "We know." The girl cut her off, not rudely, but with the efficiency of someone stating simple facts. "Mr. Whitmore left town. Papa said good riddance to bad rubbish, though he told us not to repeat that." She paused, then added with perfect seriousness, "So please don't mention I told you." "Your papa?" Claire crouched down despite the snow, bringing herself to eye level with the children. Up close, she could see the girl's eyes were the color of winter sky, sharp with intelligence and something harder. Necessity, perhaps. The kind that came from learning too young that childhood was a luxury not everyone could afford. "Where is your father? Are you lost?" "No, ma'am. We came to fetch you." The girl glanced at her brother, whose tears had frozen in tiny crystals on his cheeks. "This is Ben. I'm Josie. Josie Holloway. Our mama died birthing Ben, and Papa's been alone since, trying to manage the farm and us and everything. He needs a wife." She stated it as plainly as if she were listing items at the general store. "We need a mama, and you need somewhere to go." The stark honesty of it took Claire's breath away. No pretense, no pretty words, just the cold facts of survival laid bare by a child who'd learned to see the world exactly as it was. "Your father sent you to fetch me? In this storm?" Something flickered across Josie's face, there and gone too quickly to read. "Papa doesn't know we're here, but he won't turn you away. He's not that kind of man." She held out her free hand, the fingers red and chapped, the nails bitten short. "Will you come? Our house isn't much, but it's warm, and we have stew." Claire looked at that outstretched hand, at the 2 children standing in a blizzard with the casual fearlessness of those who'd grown up hard, and felt something crack open in her chest. They'd come for her. 2 children she'd never met had walked through a Dakota winter storm to offer her shelter because they'd heard there was a woman at the station with nowhere to go. It was insane. It was dangerous. Their father might very well send her back into the storm. She'd be following strangers, breaking every rule of sense and safety her mother had ever taught her. But the depot door was locked. The lean-to would kill her as surely as the open plains, and these children's hands were already turning blue with cold. Claire stood, hefted her carpet bag, and took Josie's hand. "Lead the way." The girls' fingers were shockingly cold even through both their gloves, but they closed around Claire's with fierce determination. Ben took Claire's other hand without being asked, his small face tilting up at her with something like wonder, as though women who appeared from trains and blizzards were magical creatures he'd only heard about in stories. Together, the 3 of them stepped off the platform into the storm. The wind tried to tear them apart immediately. Claire bent forward, pulling the children close against her sides, using her body to shield them as they pushed into the teeth of the blizzard. The town disappeared behind them within a dozen steps, swallowed by white. Josie led them with the confidence of someone who could navigate these streets blind, turning down paths Claire couldn't see, following landmarks invisible beneath the snow. Her carpetbag banged against her legs, growing heavier with every step, but she didn't dare put it down. Everything she owned was in that bag. Not much, but hers. "How far?" she shouted over the wind. "Quarter mile," Josie shouted back. "Maybe less. Papa built close to town for the children's sake, so we could walk to school." A quarter mile. In this weather, it might as well be 10. Claire's lungs burned with every breath of knife-cold air. Her face had gone numb, and she'd lost feeling in her toes 5 minutes ago. Beside her, Ben stumbled, and she caught him, lifting him partially off his feet to keep him moving. He was lighter than he should be, all sharp angles and bird-bone fragility. When had these children last had a proper meal? The question burned itself into her mind, joining the larger questions circling like the storm itself. What kind of father let his children get this thin? What kind of man sent his daughters, or allowed them to go, into a blizzard to fetch a stranger? And what kind of fool was she for following? But Ben's hand in hers was real. Josie's determined steps were real. And somewhere ahead, if the girl spoke truth, there was a house. Warmth. Stew. One night of shelter, and in the morning she could decide what came next. "There," Josie's shout came triumphant. "See the light?" Claire squinted through the snow and saw it. A dim, golden glow, barely visible through the white curtain of storm, warm as a promise. A window, a lamp, a house. Relief flooded through her so strongly her knees nearly buckled. They covered the last 100 yards in a stumbling run, the children pulling her forward now with renewed energy. The house materialized from the darkness like something from a dream, small and rough-built but blessedly solid. Smoke rising from a chimney to be torn away by the wind. A sagging porch ran across the front, and as they stumbled up the steps, the door flew open. A man filled the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, backlit by firelight so Claire couldn't see his face. But she felt his presence like a physical force, all coiled tension and barely restrained fury. "Josie." His voice was deep, rough-edged, vibrating with an anger so cold it made the blizzard seem warm. "What in God's name have you done?" Josie pushed past him, pulling Ben with her, leaving Claire alone on the porch facing the stranger who was supposed to be her salvation. He stepped forward into the lamplight, and Claire got her first clear look at Grant Holloway. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair and darker eyes set in a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the Dakota Badlands. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pulling that eye into a permanent slight squint that made him look dangerous. But it was his expression that made Claire's stomach drop. Not anger, exactly, but a bone-deep wariness, the look of a man who'd learned the hard way that nothing good came unexpected to his door. "I'm sorry," Claire began, her voice shaking from cold and shock and the sheer overwhelming wrongness of the whole situation. "I didn't mean your daughter said—" "I know what my daughter said." Grant's eyes raked over her, taking in her city clothes, her carpet bag, the snow caked in her hair. "She had no right. I sent no letter, made no arrangements. Whatever brought you here, it wasn't my doing. Papa!" Josie's voice came sharp from inside the house. "She was going to freeze! The depot was closed and Mr. Whitmore left and there wasn't anywhere—" "I don't recall asking you to speak." Grant's words cut through his daughter's protest like a blade, not loud, but absolute. The house went silent. He turned back to Claire and she saw him struggling with something, duty warring with whatever demons drove him. "But she's right about the cold. You can't go back out in this, not tonight." It wasn't a welcome. It was barely an acknowledgement. But it was permission to step over the threshold, and Claire took it before he could change his mind. The warmth of the house hit her like a wall, so intense after the bitter cold that it hurt. Her skin burned and tingled as feelings started creeping back into her frozen extremities. She stood dripping on the rough wooden floor, her carpetbag still clutched in numb fingers, and looked around. The house was small, a single room with a ladder leading to a loft overhead. A wood stove radiated heat from one corner, a pot of something bubbling on top filling the air with the smell of meat and vegetables. 2 rough-hewn beds stood against opposite walls, and a table with 4 mismatched chairs occupied the center of the space. It was clean, Claire noticed. Sparse and worn, but swept and tidy, everything in its place with the military precision of a man fighting chaos on all fronts. Josie and Ben huddled near the stove, thawing themselves, watching the adults with wide eyes. Grant closed the door against the storm, and the sudden silence felt louder than the wind had been. "There's stew," he said finally, not looking at her. "You'll eat. Then we'll talk about tomorrow." Tomorrow. When the storm passed and she'd have to leave, have to find some other solution because this man clearly wanted nothing to do with mail-order brides or charity cases or whatever category she fell into in his mind. Claire nodded, too exhausted and overwhelmed to argue, and set her bag down carefully against the wall. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm Claire. Claire Dawson." Grant Holloway. He moved past her to the stove, ladled stew into a wooden bowl with economical movements. "Sit." It wasn't an invitation so much as an order, but Claire sank into one of the chairs gratefully, her legs finally giving out. Grant set the bowl in front of her, placed a spoon beside it, then served his children with the same efficient care. Only when they were all seated did he serve himself, taking the chair farthest from Claire as though she might be contagious. The stew was simple: potatoes, carrots, some kind of meat. But it was hot and savory, and the best thing Claire had ever tasted. She ate without speaking, focusing on the food and the warmth and trying not to think about what came next. Across the table, Ben watched her with open fascination, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Is she staying, Papa?" he asked finally, his voice small and hopeful. "Eat your supper, Ben." "But is she?" "That's not your concern." "I want her to stay." Ben's lower lip jutted out stubbornly. "I like her. She's pretty. And she walked through the storm with us. Mama would have liked her." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Grant's spoon froze halfway to his bowl, his entire body going rigid. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "You will not speak of your mother. Not to this woman. Not about this woman. Do you understand me?" Ben's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, his chin trembling. Josie reached across the table and squeezed her brother's hand, shooting her father a look of pure defiance that he either didn't see or chose to ignore. Claire set her spoon down carefully, her appetite gone. The grief in this house was palpable, sitting at the table like an unwelcome guest, poisoning everything it touched. She understood suddenly why Josie had come to fetch her, why these children were so desperate for something, someone, to fill the hole their mother's death had left. But she also understood, looking at Grant's shuttered face, that he wasn't interested in filling that hole. He'd built walls around it instead, high and thick, and anyone who tried to climb them would be pushed back down. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, addressing Grant directly. "And I'm sorry for the intrusion. I'll leave first thing in the morning. I'll find some way—" "Morning train doesn't run Sundays," Grant interrupted. "Next eastbound is Monday, assuming the storm clears. You'll stay until then." Monday. 2 days. Claire's mind raced through the implications. 2 days in this tiny house with a grieving widower who clearly resented her presence, and 2 children who looked at her like she might be their salvation. 2 days of tension so thick she could taste it, but also 2 days of warmth, of food, of shelter from the storm. 2 days to figure out what in God's name she was going to do with her life now that every plan had shattered like ice. "Thank you," she said again, because there was nothing else to say. "I appreciate your hospitality." Grant grunted, which seemed to be his version of acknowledgement, and returned to his stew. They finished the meal in silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howl of wind around the eaves. When the bowls were empty, Josie stood and began clearing the table without being asked, moving with the practiced efficiency of a child who'd been running a household for years. Ben helped, carrying his bowl carefully to the wash basin, and Claire started to rise to assist. "Sit." Grant's command stopped her. "You're a guest. Tomorrow you can work. Tonight you rest." There was something in the word work that caught her attention. Not charity, then. Not pure hospitality. If she stayed, she'd earn her keep. The thought steadied her somehow, gave her something solid to stand on. She could work. She was good at working. While Josie and Ben cleaned up, Grant moved to the ladder and climbed to the loft, returning moments later with a pile of blankets and a thin pillow. He arranged them on one of the beds with the same careful efficiency he applied to everything, then stepped back. "You'll sleep here. Children are in the loft. I'll take the other bed." He paused, then added with emphasis, "That door bar's from the inside if you're worried." It took Claire a moment to understand what he meant, that he was telling her she'd be safe, that he wouldn't touch her, that she could lock him out if she feared otherwise. Heat flooded her cheeks. I didn't think." "Good." He turned away, dismissing the topic. "Josie, Ben, bed, now." The children scrambled up the ladder with the speed of long practice, calling soft goodnights that Grant acknowledged with a nod. Claire stood awkwardly by her assigned bed, still wearing her damp coat, her hair coming loose from its pins, feeling more out of place than she'd ever felt in her life. "Mr. Holloway," she began, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "I'm sorry" seemed presumptuous. Everything seemed wrong. He looked at her finally, really looked at her, and she saw something flicker in those dark eyes. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. The acknowledgement of one survivor seeing another. "Storm will blow itself out by morning," he said quietly. "Monday's train will get you wherever you need to go. Until then, this is as safe a place as any. Try to sleep." Then he turned down the lamp until only embers from the stove lit the room, settled into his own bed fully clothed, and rolled to face the wall. The conversation, such as it was over. Claire removed her damp coat with shaking fingers, hung it on a peg by the door, and lay down on the narrow bed in her dress and undergarments. The blankets smelled of cedar and wood smoke and something else, something feminine that made her throat tight. His wife's blankets, probably. His wife's bed. She was sleeping in a dead woman's place, and tomorrow, Monday, she'd leave it behind and figure out how to survive without a plan, without money, without anything but her own stubborn will. The wind screamed around the house like something alive and angry, testing every board and shingle. Somewhere in the loft, Ben whimpered in his sleep, and she heard Josie's soft voice soothing him. Grant's breathing across the room was so quiet she had to strain to hear it, deliberate and controlled, the breathing of a man forcing himself to relax. Claire closed her eyes and tried not to think about Philadelphia, about the small room in her aunt's boarding house that she'd left behind, about Charles Whitmore and the future he'd promised and stolen in the same breath. Tried not to think about Monday's train and where it would take her. Instead, she thought about two children brave enough to walk into a blizzard for a stranger, about a scarred man offering shelter to someone who'd brought chaos to his carefully ordered life. And somewhere in the darkness, between the howling wind and the crackling fire, she thought about the way Josie had said, "Our house isn't much, but it's warm," with a kind of fierce pride that spoke of loving something despite, or maybe because of, its imperfections. The storm raged through the night, but inside the little house, Claire finally slept. She woke to silence, not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but the shocked hush that follows a storm's passing, as though the world itself was catching its breath. Pale light filtered through the single window, and she could hear movement in the loft. Whispered voices, the creak of floorboards. Grant's bed was already empty, the blankets pulled military tight. Claire sat up, her body aching from the previous day's ordeal in the unfamiliar bed. Her dress was wrinkled and still slightly damp, her hair a disaster. She felt grimy and disheveled and utterly out of place, but there was nothing to be done about it. She had one other dress in her carpet bag, equally wrinkled and no privacy to change even if she wanted to. The door opened, bringing a blast of cold air, and Grant Holloway covered in snow. He stomped his boots on the threshold, shaking ice from his coat, and his eyes found Claire with the wary acknowledgement of someone finding a stray dog still on his porch in the morning. "Storm dumped 2 feet," he said without preamble. "Drifts are higher, path to town will need clearing, fire needs tending, and there's breakfast to make. You said you could work." It took Claire a moment to catch up, to realize he was offering her exactly what he'd promised, the chance to earn her keep. She stood, smoothing her wrinkled skirt as best she could. "Yes. What do you need?" Something that might have been approval flickered across his face, there and gone in an instant. "Start with breakfast. Cornmeal's in the tin, lard's in the crock, pans hanging on the wall. Make enough for 4. He paused, then added grudgingly, Children like them sweet if there's molasses. Then he was gone, back out into the snow, leaving Claire alone in the kitchen. She stood for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple domesticity of the task, then moved to the stove and began to work. It felt good to have something concrete to do, something useful. Her hands remembered the movements even though it had been years since she'd cooked over a wood stove, measuring cornmeal, mixing in water and lard, heating the pan just right. "Can I help?" Josie's voice came soft from the loft ladder. She and Ben descended together, both still in their nightclothes, their hair standing up in sleepy tangles. "You can show me where things are," Claire suggested, "and maybe keep the fire fed while I cook?" Josie's face lit up like Christmas morning. She flew into action, showing Claire the molasses, the salt, the dried apples they could chop and mix into the cornmeal. Ben sat at the table and watched, his thumb creeping toward his mouth before Josie shot him a look, and he snatched it away, trying to appear grown up. They worked together in comfortable silence, and Claire felt something ease in her chest. Whatever happened Monday, whatever future waited beyond this small house, she had this moment. These children, this warm kitchen, and the smell of cornmeal cakes browning in the pan. Grant returned as she was plating the food, his arms full of firewood that he stacked with careful precision by the stove. He washed his hands in the basin, dried them on a rough towel, and sat at the table without comment. But when Claire set a plate in front of him, 3 golden cornmeal cakes with apples and molasses, steam rising into the cold air, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. "Smells good," he said quietly. Ben took a huge bite and announced through a full mouth, "She's a good cook, Papa. Better than Josie." "Benjamin Holloway, manners," Josie hissed, but she was grinning. "It's true, though," Ben insisted. "And she's pretty. Can she stay, please? She could be our—" "Ben." Grant's voice cracked like a whip. "Enough." The joy drained from the table as fast as it had come. Ben's face crumpled, and Josie stared at her plate, all the light gone from her eyes. Claire set down her fork carefully, her own appetite vanishing. She'd been here less than 24 hours, and already she was causing pain, bringing up wounds these children carried like open sores. "Mr. Holloway," she said carefully, "I understand this is difficult. I'm grateful for your hospitality, but I don't want to make things harder for your family. Perhaps I could wait out the day at the depot. Depot's not heated on Sundays." He didn't look at her, focusing on cutting his cornmeal cake with military precision. "You'll stay here until Monday. We made an agreement." An agreement, as though she'd had any choice, any other option. But Claire swallowed her pride and nodded. "Then let me earn my keep properly. What else needs doing?" He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw him weighing something behind those dark eyes. Making some kind of calculation about trust and risk, and whether she was worth the trouble. Finally, he gestured toward the pile of mending she could see stacked in the corner, shirts with torn seams, pants with holes in the knees, socks that needed darning. "Children grow faster than I can keep up," he said simply, "and I'm no hand with a needle." It was work, real work. Claire nodded. "I can do that. Do you have thread? Needles? Wife's sewing basket is under the bed, the one you slept in." He said it without emotion, but the words landed heavy in the room. His wife's bed, his wife's needles, his wife's place that Claire was temporarily filling like water poured into a cup-shaped hole. She spent the morning mending while Grant worked outside and the children did their lessons at the table. Josie could read remarkably well for 9 years old, sounding out words in a battered McGuffey reader that had clearly seen better days. Ben was still learning his letters, and Claire found herself pausing in her stitching to help him trace them on a slate, her finger guiding his. "That's an A," she said softly. "Like in your name. And your sister's." "And apple," Ben added proudly. "And axe. Papa's got an axe." "That's right. Very good." Grant came in for the noon meal, bread and butter and cold bacon from breakfast, and found them bent over the slate together, Claire's hand over Ben's as they practiced writing cat. He stopped in the doorway, and Claire looked up to find an expression on his face she couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, but something raw and painful, like watching something that hurt too much to acknowledge. "Papa, look!" Ben held up the slate. "Claire taught me to write cat, C-A-T. Can I show you? Later, Grant moved to the basin, washed, and sat at the table with his back very straight, not looking at any of them. After you eat. They ate in tense silence, and afterward Grant retreated outside again, working with an intensity that seemed driven by demons Claire couldn't name. She returned to her mending, working her way through the pile with steady determination. As the winter sun tracked across the sky, she repaired 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, and 6 socks, her fingers flying through stitches while her mind raced through all the tomorrows stretching ahead. Monday, she'd take the train. But to where? She had $20 to her name, enough for a ticket, but not much else. No family who'd take her back. Her aunt had made it clear that leaving for marriage was permanent. Returning in disgrace was unthinkable. No references for work. No prospects. You're thinking too loud. Claire looked up to find Josie watching her, the McGuffey reader forgotten in her lap. I'm sorry? You get this little crease right here. Josie pointed to her own forehead. When you're worried about something, you've had it all afternoon. Smart girl. Too smart for her own good, probably. Claire set down the sock she was darning. I suppose I'm thinking about Monday. About what comes next. You could stay here. Josie, I know what Papa said, but he's wrong. The girl's jaw set with fierce determination. He thinks he's fine alone, that we don't need anyone, but we do. I try, but I can't cook like you, and I can't teach Ben proper, and Papa works so hard he's going to kill himself. Her voice cracked. He needs help, we need help, and you need somewhere to be. It makes sense. It did make sense, in a stark, practical way that had nothing to do with romance or dreams, and everything to do with survival. But it also made no sense at all, because Grant Holloway had made his feelings perfectly clear. He wanted no wife, needed no help, and the sooner Claire was gone, the better. Your father doesn't want me here, sweetheart, and I won't stay where I'm not wanted. He's scared. The words came quiet from Ben, who'd been so still Claire had almost forgotten he was there. He looked up from the wooden horse he'd been playing with, his eyes solemn. Papa gets scared when things change. Mama said so. She said he's like a horse that got hurt once, and now he shies at everything, even things that want to help. The wisdom in that small observation took Claire's breath away. A horse that shies at everything. Yes. She could see it now, the way Grant flinched from kindness, from hope, from anything that might crack the careful armor he'd built. Grief had broken him, and he'd mended himself with walls. But walls, Claire knew, were just another kind of prison. That night, Grant brought in a rabbit he'd snared, already skinned and cleaned. Claire stewed it with the last of the potatoes and some dried herbs she found in a jar, and they ate together at the table while the wind picked up again outside. Not a storm, but a reminder that winter wasn't done with them yet. Monday's train should run, Grant said, his words carefully neutral. Tracks will be clear by then. I appreciate you letting me wait out the storm here. Claire kept her voice equally neutral, matching him. You've been very kind. He snorted, a sound without humor. Kindness is letting in strays. This is just practicality. Can't have women freezing on train platforms. Bad for the town's reputation. Across the table, Josie rolled her eyes so hard Claire had to fight not to smile. But before she could respond, Ben spoke up, his voice small and uncertain. If Claire leaves Monday, who's going to teach me to write? And who's going to fix Papa's shirts when they tear? Josie tries, but her stitches aren't as good. Benjamin? Grant's warning rumble. It's true. And Claire makes better cornmeal cakes. And she doesn't burn the stew like Josie does. And that is enough. Grant stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. Clear the table, both of you, then bed. The children scrambled to obey, their faces pale. Claire stood as well, reaching for her own plate, but Grant's hand shot out and caught her wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to stop her. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin, and the contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. A word, he said quietly. Outside. He released her wrist and moved to the door, grabbing his coat. Claire's heart hammered as she pulled on the coat Josie had loaned her, too small across the shoulders but better than her own wet wool, and followed him into the cold darkness. The night was crystalline clear, the storms passing, leaving behind a sky so full of stars it hurt to look at. Their breath plumed white in the air between them. Grant walked several paces from the house, putting distance between themselves and the children's sharp ears, then turned to face her. "You can encourage them," he said, and there was something almost pleading beneath the anger. "They've latched onto you like you're some kind of miracle, and when you leave Monday, it's going to break their hearts. So please, for their sake, stop being so damn perfect." Perfect. The word was so absurd, Claire almost laughed. "Mr. Holloway, I'm not trying to be anything. I'm just trying to help while I'm here." That's the problem. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. They're children. They don't understand that help is temporary. They think if they want something hard enough, if they're good enough, it'll stay. And when it doesn't, he trailed off, but Claire understood. When it doesn't, they learn that wanting things only leads to loss. "So what would you have me do?" she asked quietly. "Ignore them? Be cruel? Make them hate me so it's easier when I go?" "I'd have you remember that you're leaving." Each word was carefully spaced, deliberate. "That this isn't your home, they're not your children, and come Monday you'll be gone, and we'll go back to how things were." And how were things? The question came sharper than she intended. "Your daughter is 9 years old and running a household. Your son is hungry for affection so badly he's latched onto a stranger. You're working yourself to death trying to do everything alone because you're too damn stubborn. You know nothing about my life." The words came low and dangerous. "Nothing about what I've lost or what I'm trying to protect. You've been here one day, lady. One day. Don't presume to tell me how to raise my children or run my farm or live with my grief." He was right. She had no right, no place, no claim to any opinion about his life. But standing there in the starlight with this wounded, angry man, Claire felt something fierce rise in her chest anyway. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't know you, but I know loss. And I know that hiding from life because you're afraid of losing again isn't protecting anyone. It's just another kind of death." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear snow falling from the roof in soft plops. Grant stared at her, his face unreadable in the darkness, and for a long moment she thought he might explode, might order her off his property storm or no storm. Instead, he did something worse. He laughed. A short, bitter sound with no joy in it. "You're braver than you look," he said finally. "Standing there telling a man you just met that he's living wrong, or stupider. Haven't decided which yet." "Probably both," Claire admitted, and was rewarded with another of those almost smiles. He turned away from her, looking out at the snow-covered fields, his land, his world. "My wife died screaming," he said suddenly, conversationally, as though discussing the weather. "Took her 2 days. The baby, Ben, he was breech, and by the time we got help he was stuck and she was bleeding, and there was nothing anyone could do. She begged me to save the baby, made me promise. So I held her hand while she died so my son could live, and for months afterward I could barely look at him without hearing her screams." Claire's throat closed. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but sensed that any touch would shatter whatever fragile honesty had allowed him to speak. "I got past it," Grant continued. "Learned to love my boy. But I also learned that loving things means losing them eventually. That's just how life works. You love, you lose, you survive the loss. And the surviving is the hardest part. It's the part that never stops hurting. So forgive me if I'm not eager to open that door again. Not for anyone." "I wasn't asking you to," Claire found her voice, kept it gentle. "I was just pointing out that your children are paying the price for your fear." He turned back to her, and in the starlight she could see the scar on his eyebrow, the hard lines around his mouth, the face of a man aged by grief. "Monday," he said quietly. "You'll go Monday, and we'll forget you were ever here." Then he walked back to the house, leaving her alone in the cold. But as Claire stood there, watching her breath freeze in the air, she thought about Josie's fierce pride and Ben's hungry eyes, and Grant's carefully maintained walls. She thought about how she'd come west on a stranger's promise and found something else entirely. Not a husband, but a family so broken they'd forgotten what whole looked like. Monday, she'd leave. She'd have to. Grant had made that clear. But between now and Monday, there was still tomorrow, still Sunday. Still hours of time in which she could mend more than just torn shirts, and teach more than just letters. And maybe, just maybe, show a scarred, scared man that sometimes the things worth having were exactly the ones that frightened you most. Inside the house, lamplight glowed warm through the window. Claire took a deep breath of crystalline winter air, squared her shoulders, and went back inside to face whatever tomorrow would bring. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that only comes after a storm, the world scrubbed clean and glittering with fresh snow. Claire woke to the sound of the stove being stoked, the crackle and pop of wood catching fire, and opened her eyes to find Grant already dressed and moving through the dim pre-dawn light with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to early rising. He glanced over when he heard her stir, his expression carefully neutral, last night's raw conversation sitting between them like a living thing neither wanted to acknowledge. "Coffee's on," he said simply, then pulled on his coat and headed outside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that somehow felt louder than a slam. Claire lay still for a moment, staring at the rough ceiling beams and trying to sort through the tangle of emotions his midnight confession had stirred up. She'd heard grief before, had felt it herself when her parents died, leaving her orphaned at 16 to the mercy of an aunt who viewed her as unpaid labor. But Grant's grief was different. It wasn't the soft, fading ache of time-healed wounds. It was fresh and raw and angry, a wound he kept deliberately open because closing it felt like betrayal. "Claire?" Ben's sleepy voice drifted down from the loft. "Are you awake?" "I'm awake, sweetheart. Is it Sunday? Do we get to have a nice breakfast on Sunday?" From the loft ladder, Josie's face appeared, her hair braided for sleep but already coming loose. "Ben, hush. Papa says we're not to pester her." "I wasn't pestering. I was just asking." Claire sat up, pushing the blankets aside, and smiled at them both despite the heaviness in her chest. "Sunday deserves a nice breakfast. What if we made flapjacks? Do you have flour and eggs?" Ben scrambled down the ladder so fast he nearly fell, his nightshirt flapping around his knees. "We have eggs. Papa's got 3 chickens and they're laying good now that spring's almost here, and we have flour in the bin." "Then flapjacks it is." Claire stood, smoothing her wrinkled dress, acutely aware that she'd now worn the same clothes for 2 days straight. Tomorrow she'd have to change into her other dress, wrinkled or not, before boarding the train. The thought sat sour in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. Today was Sunday. She'd worry about Monday when it came. The children helped her mix the batter, Ben standing on a chair to reach the bowl, his tongue poking out in concentration as he stirred. Josie gathered eggs from the henhouse, coming back with her cheeks pink from cold and 3 brown eggs cradled carefully in her apron. Together they created something that felt almost like a family, moving around the small kitchen with easy coordination. And when Grant came back inside, stomping snow from his boots, he stopped in the doorway at the sight of them. "Smells good," he said after a moment, his voice carefully neutral. "Sit, Papa," Ben commanded. "Claire's making flapjacks, and they're going to be the best ever." Grant's eyes found Claire's across the room, and she saw the question there, the wariness. She kept her expression calm, non-threatening, showing him without words that she remembered their conversation, remembered the boundaries he'd drawn. This was just breakfast, just one more meal before she left. He sat. The flapjacks were golden and fluffy, and Claire served them with a precious spoonful of maple syrup. Grant produced from a high shelf, rationed carefully so each person got exactly the same amount. They ate in companionable silence, the kind that comes from shared morning comfort rather than tension. And for just a few minutes, Claire let herself pretend this was normal, that she belonged here, that tomorrow wasn't coming to tear it all apart. "I was thinking," Josie said carefully, setting down her fork and looking at her father with the calculated expression of someone about to venture onto dangerous ground, "that maybe we could all go to town today, for church." Grant's jaw tightened. "We don't go to church." "We used to, before Mama died, and Mrs. Henderson always said we should come back, that the congregation misses us." "Mrs. Henderson can mind her own business." "Papa." I said no, Josephine. The use of her full name was a warning. Drop it. But Josie, Claire was learning, had her father's stubborn streak running through her like iron and stone. Claire might want to go. She hasn't been in town properly, and people should meet her before she leaves, so they know she was here and she was respectable, and why would anyone need to know she was here? Grant's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "She's leaving tomorrow. There's no reason for the whole town to know our business." The words stung more than Claire wanted to admit, as though she were something shameful, something to be hidden away. She set down her own fork carefully, keeping her voice level. "I don't need to go to church, but Josie's right that I should show my face in town before I leave. I don't want people thinking anything improper about why I was here." Grant's face darkened. "Anyone who knows me knows that I didn't." He stopped, frustrated, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, we'll go to town, but not for church. For supplies. We need flour and salt, and I want to check on the Johansson's place, make sure they got through the storm all right." It was a compromise, which meant it was also a victory. Josie's face lit up, and even Ben bounced in his chair with excitement. Claire simply nodded, accepting the olive branch for what it was. They prepared for town with the organized chaos of people unused to the process. Josie and Ben washed their faces until they shone, and Grant disappeared into the loft, returning in a clean shirt that had clearly been saved for special occasions, the fabric still crisp from lack of use. Claire had no choice but to brush off her traveling dress as best she could and pin up her hair with the few pins she had left, trying to look respectable despite wearing the same clothes she'd arrived in. The walk to town was nothing like the desperate flight through the blizzard 2 nights before. The sun was brilliant on the fresh snow, making everything sparkle like diamonds scattered across white velvet. Ben ran ahead, throwing snowballs at fence posts and laughing when he missed, his joy infectious. Even Grant seemed to thaw slightly in the sunshine, his shoulders losing some of their perpetual tension as they walked. "Your farm," Claire ventured, gesturing at the field stretching white and clean on either side of the road. "What do you grow?" "Wheat mostly, some corn, vegetables for the table." His answers were clipped, but not unfriendly. "It's good land. Hard land, but good. Soil's rich when you can coax it right." "How long have you been here?" 8 years. Came west with my wife after we married. She was from Virginia, hated the cold, but she loved the openness. The sky." He paused, and Claire saw him struggle with whether to say more. She said it made her feel like she could breathe for the first time in her life, like there was room to be whoever she wanted. The grief in his voice was palpable, but softer than last night's raw anger, more memory than wound. Claire didn't push, just nodded and let the moment settle between them. Sometimes the best comfort was simply bearing witness to someone's pain without trying to fix it. Town materialized ahead of them, a collection of wooden buildings lining a single main street, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear blue sky. It looked smaller in daylight, less threatening, though Claire felt her stomach clench with nervousness as they approached. People would stare, would whisper, would wonder who she was and why she was walking with the Holloways like she belonged there. The general store was warm and crowded with Sunday after church shoppers, and the moment Grant walked through the door with Claire at his side, conversation stopped. Every eye in the place turned toward them, curiosity naked on weathered faces. Claire felt herself flush but kept her chin up, her expression calm. She'd done nothing wrong, had nothing to be ashamed of. Grant Holloway. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Haven't seen you in town for weeks. Thought maybe the snow had buried you out there." "We manage, Mrs. Kellen." Grant's voice was polite but distant. "Need flour and salt, and lamp oil if you have it." Mrs. Kellen's gaze slid past him to Claire, taking in every detail with the thorough assessment of a woman who made it her business to know everyone's business. "And who might this be? Don't believe I've had the pleasure." Before Grant could answer, Josie stepped forward with the fearless confidence of youth. "This is Miss Claire Dawson. She's staying with us for a few days. She was supposed to meet Mr. Whitmore, but he left town, so Papa offered her shelter until the Monday train." The explanation was perfect, truthful enough to satisfy propriety, vague enough to avoid scandal. But Mrs. Kellen's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline anyway, and Claire could practically see her mind working, sorting through implications and gossip potential. "Is that so?" The words dripped with implication. "How very charitable of you, Grant, taking in a stranger, a woman, alone in your house with 2 young children and no chaperone." The temperature in the store dropped 10 degrees. Grant went very still, His jaw clenched so tight, Claire could see the muscle jumping. When he spoke, his voice was soft and deadly. "Are you implying something, Mrs. Kellen?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm simply observing that appearances matter, especially in a small town. People talk, and a woman living under a man's roof without a ring on her finger." She let the sentence trail off meaningfully. Heat flooded Claire's face, shame and anger warring in her chest. This was exactly what she'd feared, exactly why Grant hadn't wanted to bring her to town. But before she could speak, before she could defend herself or apologize or run from the store in humiliation, Josie stepped between them and Mrs. Kellen, her small body vibrating with fury. "Miss Claire saved Ben's life in the blizzard," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "She taught me better stitching and helped me with reading and made Papa smile for the first time since Mama died. So you can keep your nasty thoughts to yourself, Mrs. Kellen, because we're grateful she's there, and we don't care what you or anyone else thinks." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the store stood frozen, shocked by the outburst from a 9-year-old girl who should have known better than to speak to her elders that way. Claire's hand flew to her mouth, torn between pride at Josie's fierce defense and horror at the consequences. Mrs. Kellen's face went red, then white, then red again. "Why, you little Grant Holloway, you need to teach that girl some manners before she speaks truth." Grant's voice cut across the store like a blade. "Every word. And if you or anyone else in this town has something to say about Miss Dawson or her character or her presence in my home, you can say it to my face right now. Otherwise, give me my flour and salt and we'll be on our way." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Kellen opened her mouth, closed it, then turned with sharp, angry movements to measure out flour from the barrel. The other customers suddenly found their own business fascinating, avoiding eye contact with the Holloways and their scandalous house guest. Claire wanted to sink through the floor. This was exactly what she'd tried to avoid. Bringing shame on Grant's family, giving the town ammunition to use against these children. She touched Grant's arm lightly, her voice low. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come. I should have stayed at the house." He looked down at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite warmth, but not the cold distance she'd grown used to either. "You've got nothing to apologize for. Mrs. Kellen's always been a viper. Spreading poison is just her nature." Mrs. Kellen slammed the flour sack on the counter with more force than necessary. "That'll be $3, and you can tell your daughter that her behavior today won't be forgotten. Neither will yours." Grant counted out the money precisely, then gathered his purchases. "Come on, children, Miss Dawson, we're done here." They walked out into the sunshine, and Claire felt like she could finally breathe again, but her relief was short-lived. Behind them, she could hear the store erupting in whispered conversation, could feel the weight of judgment following them down the street like a shadow. "I'm so sorry," she said again, this time to Josie. "You shouldn't have had to defend me like that. You'll pay for it at school tomorrow, won't you?" Josie shrugged, trying to appear brave, but Claire saw the worry in her eyes. "I don't care. She had no right to talk about you that way." "She had every right." Grant's voice was heavy. "Everything she said was true. A woman under my roof with no ring, no marriage, no propriety. It looks exactly like what it isn't. And in a town this size, appearances are everything." The weight of his words settled over them like fresh snow, cold and suffocating. This was why he'd wanted her gone. Why he'd drawn such hard lines. Not because he didn't need help or didn't want it, but because accepting it came at a cost he'd known his children would have to pay. They walked in silence to the Johanssons' farm on the edge of town, where Grant checked on the elderly couple and helped them dig out from the storm. Mrs. Johansson, a tiny woman with kind eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis, insisted they come in for coffee, and her gaze on Claire was curious but warm, nothing like Mrs. Kellen's sharp judgment. "It's good of you to help Grant," she said quietly, while the men talked outside and the children played with the Johanssons' old dog. "He's been alone too long. Needs someone to share the load." "I'm only here until tomorrow," Claire explained, her throat tight. "The Monday train." "Pity." Mrs. Johansson poured coffee into chipped cups. "You seem like you fit. Not many women could handle a man as stubborn as Grant Holloway, but you've got steel in your spine. I can see it." Steel in her spine. If only that were enough. If only wanting to stay and actually being able to stay were the same thing. Claire accepted the coffee with thanks and said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say. The walk home was quieter, the joy of the morning gone. Ben trudged along with his shoulders slumped, and Josie's earlier defiance had faded into worried silence. Grant carried the supplies with his jaw set, looking like a man marching toward battle rather than home. Back at the house, he set down the flour and salt, hung up his coat, then turned to face Claire with an expression she couldn't quite read. "We need to talk." Her heart sank. "If this is about what happened in town, it's about tomorrow." He glanced at the children, who'd gone very still. "Ben, Josie, outside. Feed the chickens and check the water trough." "But Pop, now." They went, casting worried looks over their shoulders. When the door closed behind them, Grant turned back to Claire and she braced herself for whatever was coming. Anger, maybe. Or just a firm reminder that she was leaving and good riddance. What she got instead was a question. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. "Tomorrow. When you get on that train." "Where are you headed?" Claire opened her mouth, then closed it, because the honest answer was nowhere. She had no plan, no destination, no idea what came next. I'll figure something out. There are other towns, other opportunities." With $20 and no references? His voice wasn't cruel, just brutally honest. You know what happens to women like that. Women with nowhere to go and no one to vouch for them. Heat flooded her cheeks because yes, she knew. She'd grown up in Philadelphia, had seen women driven to desperation, to choices that destroyed them slowly from the inside out. "I'll find work. I'm a good seamstress, a decent cook, and every boarding house in every town between here and the coast is full of good seamstresses and decent cooks." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to understand what you think is waiting for you out there." "What do you want me to say?" The words came sharper than she intended, her own fear and frustration bubbling over. That I'm terrified? That I have no idea what I'm doing? That coming west was the stupidest decision I've ever made? Fine, it's all true, but it doesn't change the fact that I can't stay here. You made that clear. I made it clear because I thought... He stopped, seemed to struggle with something. What happened in town today is exactly what I was trying to avoid. The gossip, the judgment. It's not fair to you or the children. So I'll leave. Problem solved. Except it's not solved. The words burst from him with unexpected force. Because Josie's right, damn the girl. She's always right. We do need help. I am working myself to death trying to run this place alone, and the children are suffering for it. And you... He trailed off, looking at her with something almost like desperation. You fit here. In 2 days, you've done more for this family than anyone has in 4 years. And the idea of watching you get on that train, of never knowing if you ended up safe or if you... He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Claire's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying... He stopped again, clearly fighting with himself, years of carefully built walls warring with whatever had cracked them open. I'm saying there might be another option, if you were willing to consider it. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. What option? Grant crossed to the window, staring out at the snow-covered fields, his broad shoulders tense. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, as though he were picking his way through a minefield. A marriage, of convenience, legal, binding, but practical rather than romantic. You'd have a home, security, my name to protect you. The children would have someone to help raise them. I'd have help running the farm, it makes sense. A marriage of convenience, not love, not even affection, just a practical arrangement between two desperate people. Claire should have been insulted, should have said no immediately, preserved her dignity, held out for something more. But standing in that small kitchen with winter sunlight streaming through the window and Grant's scarred, careful face reflected in the glass, she found herself considering it. What was waiting for her out there? What grand future was she preserving herself for? She'd already gambled everything on a stranger's promise once and lost. At least this time she'd know exactly what she was getting. A home, children who needed her, work that mattered, and a man who, for all his walls and grief and stubborn pride, was at least honest about what he could and couldn't offer. The town would still talk, she said quietly. Let them talk. At least you'd have a ring to show them. Your children would have expectations about what a mother is, what a wife should be. They'd have someone who actually gives a damn about them. That's more than some children get from their blood parents. And you? She needed to know this, needed it clear between them. What would you expect from me? He turned from the window, met her eyes directly. Work, partnership, respect. Nothing more unless you decided you wanted it. I'm not looking for love, Claire. I had that. Lost it. Don't plan to risk it again, but I could use an ally, someone to stand with me against whatever comes next. An ally. Not a lover. Not even really a friend. Just someone to share the load, to face the world together, because facing it alone was killing them both slowly. It should have sounded cold, practical to the point of heartlessness. Instead, it sounded like the most honest proposal she'd ever heard. I need time to think, she managed. You've got until morning. Train leaves at 8. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. For what it's worth, I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you could handle it. This life, this place, me. But I won't lie and pretend it'll be easy. It won't be. Nothing about this is easy. Then he was gone, leaving Claire alone with a decision that felt too big for her head and her heart combined. She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her, and stared at her hands, work-roughened hands that knew how to mend and cook and survive, that had held frightened children and mixed flapjack batter and done 1,000 small things that added up to something like belonging. Outside, she could hear Grant's voice mixing with the children's laughter as they worked together. Through the window, she watched them, Ben throwing feed for the chickens with wild abandon, Josie correcting his technique with bossy precision, and Grant standing between them with his hands on his hips, shaking his head, but almost smiling. They could be her family. This could be her home. All she had to do was say yes to a marriage without love, a partnership built on need rather than want, a life that promised nothing but hard work and the possibility of belonging. Or she could get on the train tomorrow morning and disappear into a future as uncertain as the one that had brought her here in the first place. Claire closed her eyes and tried to pray for guidance, for some sign of what the right choice might be, but God, it seemed, was leaving this one up to her. The afternoon passed in strange suspension, everyone moving through familiar routines while the unspoken question hung in the air like smoke. Claire made dinner, salt pork and beans with the last of the bread, while Grant worked on repairing a broken harness and the children played quietly, sensing the tension. They ate in near silence, the easy companionship of breakfast long gone, replaced by something heavier and more fraught. After dinner, as Claire washed dishes and Grant sat at the table mending a torn work glove, Josie approached her with the careful steps of someone approaching a spooked horse. "Claire, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Are you really leaving tomorrow?" The question hung between them, simple and devastating. Claire dried her hands carefully on a towel, buying time, trying to figure out how to answer honestly without making promises she couldn't keep. "I don't know yet." "Papa asked you to stay, didn't he?" Josie's voice was quiet, but her eyes were fierce. "I saw how he looked at you. He asked you to marry him." "Josie, you should say yes." The words came rushed, desperate. "I know Papa's hard to live with and the farm's not much and the town will probably be mean to you, but we need you. And I think maybe you need us too. Don't you?" Did she? Claire looked at this fierce, brave girl who'd walked into a blizzard to save a stranger, who defended her father and raised her brother and held together a broken family with will and determination beyond her years. Then she looked at Ben, playing with his wooden horse by the fire, and at Grant, pretending not to listen while his hand stilled on the glove. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "It's a big decision, Josie. Maybe the biggest I'll ever make. Mama used to say that the scariest decisions are usually the important ones." Josie's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She said you know you're alive when you're scared, because only things that matter make your heart beat fast." Wisdom from a dead woman, delivered by her daughter, settling into Claire's bones like truth. Her heart was beating fast, had been beating fast since she stepped off that train into the blizzard. Maybe that meant she was finally, truly alive after years of just surviving. That night, Claire lay in the narrow bed that had belonged to Grant's wife and tried to imagine staying. Waking every morning in this house, cooking at this stove, mending these clothes, raising these children. Standing beside Grant, not as his love, but as his partner, facing whatever came with the quiet strength of shared purpose. It wouldn't be the romantic future she'd once dreamed of. No passionate declarations, no sweeping gestures, no fairy tale ending. But it would be real, solid, hers. Across the room, Grant's breathing was steady and controlled, but something about the quality of it told Claire he wasn't sleeping either. Both of them lying awake in the darkness, waiting for morning, for a decision that would change everything or nothing depending on what she chose. "Grant?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah?" "If I stayed, if I said yes, would you regret it?" The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I regret a lot of things. Mostly the things I didn't do, the risks I didn't take. So no, I don't think I'd regret it." "Would you resent me for not being her?" "I'd be a fool to resent you for being yourself." His voice was quiet but firm. "She was who she was. You're who you are. I'm not looking for a replacement, Claire. I'm looking for a partner. They're different things." They were different things. She could be herself here, not a shadow of a dead woman. Could build something new rather than trying to resurrect something lost. The thought settled something in her chest, eased a fear she hadn't quite known how to name. "Okay," she said into the darkness. "Okay? I'll stay. I'll marry you. I'll be your ally." The silence that followed felt different than before, lighter somehow, as though something heavy had been lifted from the air between them. She heard Grant exhale slowly, a sound that might have been relief. "Thank you," he said finally. "I know it's not what you came west for." "Nothing's been what I came west for," Claire interrupted. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe I needed to lose what I thought I wanted to find what I actually needed." "Philosopher, are you?" "Desperate woman making the best of a bad situation, more like." She heard him huff a quiet laugh, and it warmed something in her chest. Tomorrow she wouldn't get on the train. Tomorrow she'd stay. And somehow, against all odds and reason, that felt like exactly the right choice. Above them in the loft, she heard one of the children shift in their sleep, and Claire let her eyes drift closed, finally at peace. This was her home now. These were her people. And whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Morning came too fast and too slow all at once. Claire woke to the sound of the stove being lit, as she had every morning since arriving, but this time the sound meant something different. This wasn't her last morning here. This was her first morning as someone who'd chosen to stay, who'd agreed to become a Holloway in name, if not yet in heart. The weight of that decision sat on her chest like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. Grant was already dressed, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with his usual quiet efficiency. When he heard her stir, he glanced over, and something passed between them in that look. Acknowledgement, maybe, or mutual recognition that they'd both crossed a line there was no uncrossing. "Coffee'll be ready in a minute," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Then we should talk about the practical matters." Practical matters. Of course. This was a practical arrangement, after all. Claire sat up, smoothing her hopelessly wrinkled dress, and nodded. "All right." They sat at the table with steaming cups of coffee between them, while the children still slept in the loft, their soft breathing the only sound besides the crackling fire. Grant wrapped his hands around his cup like he needed the warmth, though the room was already heating nicely and didn't quite meet her eyes. "The Reverend in town is Silas Crawford," he began. "Good man. Discreet. He'll marry us without asking too many questions, and he won't gossip about the circumstances." Grant paused, took a sip of coffee. "I figure we could go this afternoon. Get it done quick, before either of us has time to think better of it." This afternoon. Claire's stomach flipped. She'd known it would have to be soon, but somehow she'd imagined a few days at least. Time to prepare, to adjust to the idea. But Grant was right. Waiting would only make it harder, give doubt time to creep in and take root. "What do I need to bring?" she asked, proud that her voice stayed steady. "Just yourself. I've got my late wife's ring stored away. It's simple, just a gold band, but it'll serve." He said it matter-of-factly, But Claire saw the tightness around his eyes and understood what it cost him to offer that ring to another woman. After the ceremony, we'll need to file papers at the land office. Make sure everything's legal and recorded. Your name on the deed, joint ownership of the farm. Claire's head snapped up. Joint ownership? Grant, that's not necessary. You don't have to— Yes, I do. His voice was firm. This is a partnership, remember? You'll be working this land same as me, raising these children, building this life. You deserve to have your name on it, to know it's yours too. Besides, he finally met her eyes, and she saw something fierce there beneath the careful control. If something happens to me, I need to know you and the children will be protected. That some distant cousin or creditor can't come take what's yours. The thought of something happening to him sent an unexpected chill through her. In just 3 days, this man had become a fixture in her world, solid and permanent as the house itself. Imagining him gone, imagining facing this life without his steady presence, felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite name. Nothing's going to happen to you, she said quietly. Life doesn't ask permission before it takes things. His words were heavy with the weight of experience. Best to be prepared. They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of what they were about to do settling over them like snow. Then Grant cleared his throat, shifting in his chair with visible discomfort. There's one more thing we should discuss, about the sleeping arrangements. Heat flooded Claire's cheeks. She'd been trying very hard not to think about that particular aspect of their arrangement. You said, when you proposed, you said you wouldn't expect anything unless I wanted, and I meant it. He cut her off firmly. I'll take the barn, fix up the tack room, make it comfortable enough. You'll have the house, the children, privacy. This marriage is legal and binding, but it doesn't have to be— He trailed off, clearly as uncomfortable with this conversation as she was. Consummated, Claire finished for him, her face burning. You don't have to sleep in the barn, Grant. That's ridiculous. It's freezing out there and you work too hard to not get proper rest. I'm not going to compromise you. You're not compromising anything. We're adults entering a practical arrangement. Surely we can share a house without— She stopped, flustered. We can be respectful of each other. Keep appropriate boundaries. You take your bed, I'll keep this one, and we'll manage like civilized people. Grant looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his dark eyes. You're sure? I'm sure. She was surprised to find she meant it. The idea of Grant sleeping in a freezing barn while she occupied his house felt wrong, punitive to them both for a situation neither had chosen. We're partners, remember? Partners don't make each other suffer needlessly. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. All right then, we'll figure it out as we go. Above them, the loft creaked as one of the children stirred. Grant stood quickly, clearly relieved to end the awkward conversation. I'll start breakfast. You should rest while you can. It's going to be a long day. But Claire stood too, moving to the stove beside him. Partners, she reminded him. We work together, remember? This time he did smile, small and fleeting but real. Partners, he agreed. They made breakfast side by side, falling into an easy rhythm that felt like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. When Josie and Ben climbed down from the loft, rubbing sleep from their eyes, Claire was pouring coffee while Grant flipped cornmeal cakes, and the domestic normalcy of it seemed to stop the children in their tracks. You're still here, Ben breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. I'm still here, Claire confirmed. Does that mean— Josie's voice was careful, afraid to hope too hard. Did you tell him yes? Claire glanced at Grant, who nodded slightly, giving her permission to share the news. I told him yes. If you'll have me, I'm going to stay. Your father and I are getting married this afternoon. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Ben let out a whoop of pure joy and launched himself at Claire, wrapping his skinny arms around her waist and squeezing with all his might. Josie's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks even as she smiled, and she pressed her hands to her mouth like she was trying to hold in feelings too big for her small body. You mean it? Josie whispered. You're really going to be our mama? The word hit Claire like a fist to the chest. Mama. She hadn't thought about it in those terms, had been so focused on the practical aspects of the arrangement that she'd somehow missed the emotional reality. These children would call her Mama, would look to her for comfort and guidance and love, would be hers in every way that mattered. "If you want me to be," she managed around the lump in her throat. Josie crossed the room in 2 steps and wrapped her arms around Claire from the side, burying her face against Claire's shoulder. "We want you," she said fiercely. "We want you so much." Over the children's heads, Claire met Grant's eyes and saw her own overwhelm reflected back at her. This was real now. Not just an agreement between 2 desperate adults, but a family forming itself from broken pieces and desperate hope. The responsibility of it was staggering, but so was the strange, unexpected rightness. They ate breakfast in a buzz of excited chatter, Ben asking 100 questions about the wedding, while Josie sat quietly glowing, her eyes never leaving Claire's face. Grant answered his son with more patience than Claire had seen from him yet, explaining that it would be a simple ceremony, just the Reverend and themselves, nothing fancy. "Can I come?" Ben asked eagerly. "I want to see you get married." Grant hesitated, glancing at Claire. She understood his uncertainty. Bringing the children meant making this real for them in a way that might hurt if things somehow went wrong. But she also knew that excluding them would hurt more, would make them feel like this marriage was something shameful to hide rather than a family coming together. "I think your children should be there," she said quietly. "If you agree. This affects them as much as us. They should be part of it." Something in Grant's expression softened. "All right. We'll all go. Make it official together." The morning passed in a strange haze of mundane tasks and mounting nervousness. Claire changed into her other dress, the blue wool that was only slightly less wrinkled than the gray, and did her best to make herself presentable. Josie insisted on helping her pin up her hair, her small fingers surprisingly deft. And when Claire caught sight of herself in the small mirror Grant produced, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with something between terror and anticipation, and she looked alive in a way she hadn't in years. "You're beautiful," Josie whispered. "Papa's going to think so too." Claire doubted Grant would think any such thing. This was a business arrangement after all. But she smiled at the girl's romantic notions and didn't argue. Let Josie have her fairy tale version. Reality would intrude soon enough. They set out for town just after noon, the 4 of them walking together down the snowy road. Grant had changed into his good shirt again and actually combed his hair, though he still looked uncomfortable in anything other than work clothes. The children walked between Claire and Grant, Ben chattering nervously while Josie stayed quiet, her hand creeping into Claire's and holding tight. Town was busier than it had been on Sunday, wagons and riders moving along Main Street, people going about their Monday business. Claire felt eyes following them as they made their way to the small white church at the far end of town, felt the weight of curiosity and judgment. By tonight, everyone would know. The mail-order bride who'd been stood up had married Grant Holloway instead. The gossip would be vicious, but she'd have a ring on her finger and a legal right to be there, and that was more armor than she'd had 2 days ago. Reverend Crawford was a thin man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Claire at ease. He welcomed them into his small office behind the sanctuary, glancing at the children with understanding. "Grant Holloway," he said warmly, shaking Grant's hand. "It's been too long. Good to see you back in town." "Reverend," Grant's voice was stiff with discomfort. "I need to ask a favor. This is Claire Dawson. We'd like to be married. Today, if possible." If the Reverend was surprised by the suddenness of the request, he hit it well. His eyes moved from Grant to Claire, assessing, then softened with something like approval. "I see. And you, Miss Dawson, you enter this marriage of your own free will?" "I do," Claire said firmly. "Then I'd be honored to perform the ceremony." He pulled a worn Bible from his desk, then paused. "Though I should ask, do you have witnesses? The law requires 2. Grant's face fell. In their rush to get this done, they'd forgotten about witnesses. Before he could speak, the door to the office opened, and Mrs. Johansson stepped in, followed by her husband. "Thought you might need us?" she said with a knowing smile. "Saw you walking to the church and figured today might be the day. Hope you don't mind the intrusion." Relief washed over Grant's face. "Not at all. Thank you." "Well then," Reverend Crawford smiled. "Shall we begin?" They stood in the small office with afternoon light streaming through the window, Ben and Josie pressed close on either side, the Johansons watching with warm approval. The Reverend opened his Bible and began to speak, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of sacred ritual. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words washed over Claire like water, familiar from 100 ceremonies she'd attended in her life, but never imagined applying to herself. She'd dreamed of a wedding once, back when she was young and foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. A church full of people, a white dress, orange blossoms, and joy. This was nothing like that dream. A hasty ceremony in a reverend's office with only 2 witnesses and 2 children who desperately needed her to say yes. But somehow, standing there with Grant's work-roughened hand reaching for hers, it felt more real than any fantasy ever had. Grant Holloway, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? Grant's hand tightened around hers. His voice was steady, firm, leaving no room for doubt. I do. And do you, Claire Dawson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? This was it. The moment of no return. Once she said these words, she'd be bound to this man, this farm, this life. No escape, no second chances. Her future stood before her in the form of a scarred, grieving widower who'd offered her partnership instead of love, who'd promised nothing but hard work and honesty, and somehow that was enough. I do, she said, and meant it. Grant released her hand and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a simple gold band that caught the light. Claire recognized it for what it was, his late wife's ring, worn smooth by years of wear, carrying the weight of a love story that had ended in tragedy. Her throat tightened as he took her left hand, his fingers gentle despite their calluses, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. By the power vested in me by the territory of Dakota and the grace of God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Crawford smiled. You may kiss your bride if you wish. The suggestion hung in the air between them, awkward and weighted. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't prepared for the public display of affection that tradition demanded. Claire saw Grant hesitate, saw the war playing out behind his eyes, duty versus desire, propriety versus the very real grief that touching another woman in this way might stir up. She made the decision for both of them, rising on her toes and pressing a quick, chaste kiss to his cheek. Safe. Appropriate. Not a real kiss, but enough to satisfy the Reverend and the watching witnesses. Grant's hand came up to touch the place she'd kissed, his expression unreadable. Then Ben was throwing himself at both of them, laughing and crying at the same time, and Josie was hugging Claire's waist, and the moment passed in a flurry of congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Johansson embraced Claire warmly. Welcome to the family, dear. You've got yourself a good man, even if he is stubborn as a mule. I heard that, Margaret, Grant said mildly, but he was almost smiling. They signed the marriage certificate with Claire's hand shaking slightly as she wrote her new name for the first time, Claire Holloway. The letters looked strange to her eyes, like someone else's handwriting, someone else's identity. But the Reverend blotted the ink and rolled the certificate carefully, handing it to Grant with a firm handshake. Take care of each other, he said simply. That's all marriage requires, really. Taking care of each other through whatever comes. From the church, they walked to the land office, where a clerk with ink-stained fingers processed the paperwork that added Claire's name to the farm's deed with bored efficiency. He barely looked at her, just recorded the information and stamped the papers, utterly unaware that he was witnessing the most important transaction of her life. When they emerged back onto the street, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the snow gold and pink. Claire looked down at the ring on her finger, at the marriage certificate tucked safely in Grant's coat pocket, and felt the reality of what they'd done settle over her like a cloak. She was married. She was Claire Holloway. She had a home, a family, a future that stretched ahead with all its terrifying uncertainty. Ice cream, Ben announced suddenly. Mama always said weddings deserve ice cream. The word mama sent a visible flinch through Grant, but he recovered quickly, his face smoothing into careful neutrality. It's the middle of winter, Ben. Ice cream will freeze you solid. But it's a special occasion. Ben's lower lip jutted out. Please, Papa? Just this once? Grant looked at Claire, clearly leaving the decision to her. She thought about saying no, about being practical and saving money and not spoiling the children. Then she thought about two kids who'd lost their mother and were trying desperately to make this strange, hurried ceremony into something joyful. Ice cream sounds perfect, she said. They walked to the general store, the same one where Mrs. Kellen had judged Claire so harshly just yesterday. Claire's stomach clenched as they approached, but she kept her chin up and her hand steady in Josie's. She had armor now, a ring, a name, a legal right to stand beside Grant Holloway. Let them stare. Mrs. Kellen was behind the counter when they entered, her sharp eyes immediately finding them and widening with poorly concealed shock. Her gaze dropped to Claire's hand, to the gold band glinting there, and her mouth pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Grant, she said coolly, back again so soon? We'd like ice cream, Grant said, his voice polite but flat. 4 dishes? Whatever flavor you've got. Ice cream. Mrs. Kellen's tone dripped with implications. Celebrating something, are we? As a matter of fact, yes. Grant's hand came to rest on the small of Claire's back, a gesture of possession and protection that sent warmth flooding through her despite the situation. Mrs. Kellen, allow me to introduce my wife. We were married this afternoon. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Kellen's face cycled through shock, outrage, and calculation so quickly Claire almost missed the transitions. Around them, other customers froze, ears practically growing to catch every word. Your wife, Mrs. Kellen repeated slowly. How very sudden. Just yesterday she was a woman living under your roof without a ring, and today she's my legal wife, with her name on my deed and her ring on her finger. Grant's voice was steel-wrapped in velvet, which I believe makes yesterday's concerns quite moot. Now, about that ice cream. For a moment, Claire thought Mrs. Kellen might refuse, might make a scene, might say something cutting and cruel that would poison this fragile new beginning. But the woman was too shrewd for that. Instead, she turned with sharp, angry movements and scooped ice cream into 4 dishes with unnecessary force. That'll be 60 cents, she said coldly. Grant paid without comment, then distributed the dishes. Vanilla for Ben, strawberry for Josie, chocolate for Claire, and vanilla for himself. They sat at the small table by the window and ate their ice cream while the entire store pretended not to watch them, and Claire felt a hysterical laugh building in her chest. This was her wedding celebration, ice cream in a hostile general store with her new stepchildren and a husband who looked like he was facing a firing squad. It was perfect. This is the best day ever, Ben announced through a mouthful of vanilla. We got a new mama and ice cream and Papa's almost smiling. I'm not almost smiling, Grant protested, but the corner of his mouth twitched. You are too, Josie accused. See, Mama, he's doing it right now. The word mama hit Claire like a physical thing, sweet and terrifying all at once. She met Grant's eyes across the table and saw her own overwhelm reflected there, mixed with something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief that they'd survived this far without falling apart. They finished their ice cream in companionable silence, then walked home as the sun set and the temperature dropped, turning the world blue and silver. The house looked different to Claire's eyes as they approached. Not a temporary shelter anymore, but home. Her home. The thought was still too big to fully grasp. Inside, while Grant built up the fire and the children changed into nightclothes, Claire stood in the center of the small room and tried to feel what was different. The space looked the same rough furniture, same worn floor, same scent of wood smoke and coffee. But she was different. The woman who'd stumbled through a blizzard 3 days ago had been lost, desperate, clinging to survival by her fingernails. The woman standing here now had a ring on her finger and children calling her mama, and a man who'd promised her partnership, if not love. You all right? Grant's voice came quiet from behind her. Claire turned to find him watching her with that careful, assessing look she was learning to recognize. I'm not sure, she admitted. I keep expecting to wake up. For this to turn out to be a dream, or a mistake, or it's not a mistake. He said it firmly, as though saying it with enough conviction could make it true. It's unusual, yes, sudden, but not a mistake. How can you be sure? He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Because you're still here. Because when you could have run, when you could have gotten on that train and never looked back, you chose this instead. That takes courage. Or foolishness. Haven't decided which yet. Probably both, Claire said, and was rewarded with another of those almost smiles. Above them, the loft creaked as the children settled in for the night. Grant glanced up, then back at Claire. They'll be asleep soon. Then we should talk. About expectations, rules, how this is going to work day to day. Rules, expectations. The practical matters that would shape their strange partnership. Claire nodded, suddenly exhausted. It had been the longest day of her life, filled with more emotion and change than she could possibly process. But Grant was right. They needed to establish boundaries, create structure. Otherwise, they'd stumble through each day making it up as they went. And that was a recipe for disaster. All right, she agreed. Let's talk. They waited until Josie and Ben's breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, then sat across from each other at the table with cups of coffee between them. The house was quiet except for the fire's crackle, intimate in a way that made Claire's pulse quicken despite herself. Grant wrapped his hands around his cup, not looking at her. I've been thinking about how to divide the work. The farm needs both of us, but we each have different skills. I figure you handle the house, the cooking, the children's education. I'll handle the fields, the livestock, the heavy repairs. That seems reasonable, Claire said, though I'd like to help with the garden when spring comes. I'm good with plants. Fine. The garden's yours. He took a sip of coffee. Money. We'll need to discuss money. Everything we have goes into the farm or the household. No separate funds, no his and hers. We're in this together, which means we decide together how resources get spent. The trust implicit in that statement took her breath away. He was offering her equal say in financial matters, treating her like a true partner rather than a dependent. I agree. Though I should tell you I have $20 saved. It's not much, but keep it. Grant cut her off. Your emergency fund. Every woman should have money put aside that's just hers. I won't touch it. Claire stared at him, this man who'd been a stranger 4 days ago and was now her husband, offering her both partnership and autonomy in the same breath. Thank you, she managed. He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. It's practical. Now, about the children. They're going to test boundaries, especially Ben. He's young enough that this transition might confuse him. Josie's going to try to be helpful, probably to the point of exhausting herself. We need to present a united front, support each other's decisions. And if we disagree, then we discuss it in private and come to a compromise before facing them. Never undermine each other in front of the kids. His eyes met hers, serious. My wife, my first wife. And I learned that the hard way. Children are smart. They'll exploit any crack in the foundation if you let them. His wife. The woman whose ring Claire now wore, whose bed she'd slept in, whose place she was trying to fill. The ghost in this house, hovering between them like smoke. Claire wanted to ask about her, wanted to know who she'd been and what she'd meant to Grant and whether Claire could ever hope to measure up. But the shuttered look on Grant's face told her the topic was off limits, at least for now. United front, she agreed instead. I can do that. They talked for another hour, working through the practical details of shared life, schedules and responsibilities, discipline and expectations. It should have been mundane, boring even. Instead, it felt like laying a foundation, setting stones one by one that would hold up whatever they built together. Finally, when the fire had burned low and exhaustion was pulling at Claire's eyelids, Grant stood and moved to his bed, the one against the far wall. He pulled off his boots, shrugged out of his coat, then paused. Claire? For what it's worth, I'm glad you stayed. I think we can make this work. The words were simple, almost awkward, but they warmed Claire more than the fire ever could. I think so too, she said softly. She prepared for bed in the dim light, changing into her nightgown with her back to Grant's side of the room, hyper-aware of his presence, even though he'd turned away to give her privacy. When she slipped between the blankets, her blankets now, in her bed, she lay very still, listening to Grant's breathing across the room and trying not to think about how strange this was. Married, but not married. Partners, but strangers. Bound together by law and necessity, but not by love. Sleep came eventually, pulling her under into dreams of snow and starlight and a gold ring that fit perfectly despite belonging to someone else first. She woke to gray morning light and the realization that Grant's bed was already empty. Through the window, she could see him outside, working despite the early hour, his breath pluming white in the cold air. In the loft, the children were stirring, and Claire heard Ben's sleepy voice asking Josie if yesterday had been real or just a dream. "It was real," Josie said firmly. "She's still here. She's our mama now." Our mama. The word settled into Claire's bones, heavy and precious and terrifying. She was someone's mama now, someone's wife, someone who belonged here, who had responsibilities and expectations, and a whole family depending on her. Claire threw back the blankets and stood, ready to face her first full day as Claire Holloway. Whatever it brought, she'd meet it head on. That's what partners did, after all. They faced things together, even when they were scared, especially when they were scared. Outside, Grant split wood with rhythmic efficiency, each strike of the axe biting deep and true. Claire watched him through the window for a moment, this man who was now her husband, and felt something shift in her chest. Not love. It was far too soon for that. But maybe the seed of something that could grow into partnership, into respect, into the kind of quiet affection that sustained people through long years and hard winters. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe it would even be better than the fairy tale she'd once imagined. Only time would tell. Claire moved to the stove and began breakfast, her hands falling into the familiar rhythm she'd learned over the past few days. The children descended from the loft already dressed, their faces bright with excitement that hadn't dimmed overnight. Ben wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pressing his face against her back. "Good morning, Mama," he said, testing the word out like something precious and fragile. The title still sent a jolt through her, but Claire forced herself to accept it naturally, to not flinch or hesitate in a way that might hurt him. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well? I dreamed about ice cream and weddings and you staying forever and ever." Forever and ever. The casual way he said it, the absolute faith in his voice, made Claire's throat tight. She turned and knelt down, bringing herself eye level with the boy. "I'm not going anywhere, Ben. This is my home now. You're my family." His face split into a grin so wide it seemed to take up his whole face, and he threw his arms around her neck, squeezing with the fierce intensity only children could manage. Over his shoulder, Claire saw Josie watching with tears in her eyes, and she held out one arm in invitation. The girl came quickly, folding herself into the embrace, and for a moment the three of them just held each other while the morning light strengthened and the smell of coffee filled the small house. The door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and Grant stamping snow from his boots. He stopped short at the sight of them tangled together on the floor, something unreadable crossing his face. Then he cleared his throat and moved to the basin to wash his hands, giving them space to separate naturally. "Wood's all split and stacked," he said, his voice gruff. "Should last us through the next cold snap." "Breakfast is almost ready," Claire replied, rising and smoothing her skirt. "Flapjacks and bacon." They ate together at the table, and Claire was struck by how different it felt from even yesterday morning. Then she'd been a guest, temporary and careful. Now she was the lady of the house, serving food in her own home to her own family. The shift was subtle but profound, changing everything about how she moved through the space. After breakfast, Grant pushed back from the table and looked at Claire seriously. "The children need to go to school today. They've missed enough days already, and people need to see that nothing's changed, that we're still a normal family." Normal family, as though anything about their situation was normal. But Claire understood what he meant. The town would be buzzing with gossip about their hasty marriage, and the best way to combat it was to act like there was nothing scandalous or shameful about it. Just a widower remarrying, children getting a new mother, life moving forward as it should. "Of course," she agreed. "What time does school start?" 8 o'clock. It's a mile walk, but they know the way." Grant hesitated, then added, "The teacher, Miss Warren, she's fair, kind. She won't let the other children be cruel." The implication hung heavy between them, that the other children might try to be cruel, that yesterday's marriage would make Josie and Ben targets for gossip and teasing. Claire's stomach clenched with worry, but she kept her expression calm for the children's sake. "I'm not afraid," Josie announced, lifting her chin with fierce pride. "Let them say what they want. I've got a mama now, and that's more than half those kids can say about having someone who actually cares." The bitter wisdom in those words, the suggestion that having any mother was better than having a biological mother who didn't care, made Claire wonder what stories Josie had witnessed at school. What homes she'd seen that made her own motherless existence seem preferable. Ben, on the other hand, looked nervous. What if they're mean? What if they say bad things about Mama? Grant reached across and ruffled his son's hair. "Then you remember that their words can't change the truth. Claire is your mother now, legal and proper. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The protective edge in his voice sent warmth through Claire's chest. Whatever else this marriage was or wasn't, Grant was clearly willing to defend it publicly. That was something. She helped the children bundle into their coats and scarves, checking that they had their slates and readers. Josie's coat was too small across the shoulders, and Ben's had a tear in the sleeve that Claire made a mental note to mend. So many things needed doing, needed fixing, needed her attention. The weight of it should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like purpose. "Be good," she told them at the door. "Learn well. I'll have something warm waiting when you get home." Josie hugged her quickly, fiercely, then grabbed Ben's hand and headed out into the cold morning. Claire stood in the doorway watching them go, two small figures trudging through the snow toward town, and felt her heart squeeze with protective love so strong it hurt. These were her children now. If anyone hurt them, made them feel small or ashamed, she'd have something to say about it. "They'll be fine," Grant's voice came from behind her. "Josie's tough as nails, and Ben's got more friends than sense. The kids at school like him." Claire closed the door and turned to find Grant pulling on his work coat. "And what about you? What are your plans for today?" "Fences need checking. Storm might have damaged some posts, and the Widow Marsh's place is just beyond our property line. Thought I'd stop by, make sure she got through all right. She's getting on in years, and her son moved to Chicago last fall." The consideration in his voice, the automatic assumption that checking on neighbors was just part of the day's work, told Claire more about Grant's character than any amount of conversation could have. He was a good man, gruff and guarded and half broken by grief, but fundamentally good. "I'll come with you," she said suddenly. "To the Widow Marsh's. I should meet the neighbors, and she might appreciate a woman's company." Grant looked surprised, then thoughtful. "It's a cold walk, 3 miles at least. I've got a warm coat and sturdy boots. I'll manage." Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "All right then, let me finish the morning chores and we'll go." While Grant tended the animals and checked the water supply, Claire cleaned the breakfast dishes and made a mental inventory of the house. They needed so many things: new curtains for the windows, a proper rug for the floor, more blankets for the coming nights when winter would bite hardest. She had her $20 saved, but that needed to stretch for emergencies. Perhaps she could find ways to make what they needed rather than buying it. Her mother had taught her to sew, to knit, to make something from nothing. Those skills would serve her well here. An hour later, she and Grant set out across the snowy fields, walking side by side in companionable silence. The landscape was beautiful in the harsh winter light, all white expanses and dark fence lines cutting geometric patterns against the sky. Claire could see why Grant's first wife had loved the openness, the sense of endless possibility stretching to every horizon. "Tell me about the Widow Marsh," she said after a while. "What should I know?" Grant considered the question as they walked. "Her name's Eleanor. She's maybe 65, sharp as a tack, but her body's failing her. Arthritis in her hands makes it hard to cook, to do the fine work. Her husband died 10 years back, and she's been managing alone since her boy left. Proud woman. Won't ask for help even when she needs it." Claire heard the affection beneath his words and understood. The Widow Marsh was someone Grant respected, someone worth caring for. That told her how to approach the visit, with deference rather than pity, offering assistance as though it were a favor to them rather than to her. The Widow Marsh's house was smaller than Grant's, a compact cabin with a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. Grant knocked firmly, calling out as he did. Eleanor, it's Grant Holloway, come to check on you after the storm. The door opened to reveal a tiny woman with white hair pulled back in a bun and eyes the color of faded denim. She looked from Grant to Claire with sharp curiosity, taking in every detail of Claire's appearance with one sweeping glance. Grant Holloway, tracking snow onto my clean floor, she said, but there was warmth beneath the scolding. And who's this you've brought with you? This is my wife, Claire. Grant said it simply, matter-of-factly, as though it weren't earth-shaking news. We married yesterday. Thought she should meet the neighbors. Eleanor's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. Your wife? Well now, that is news. Come in, both of you. I'll put coffee on, and you can tell me all about this whirlwind courtship. Inside, the cabin was scrupulously clean but sparse, furnished with just the basics and showing signs of deferred maintenance. Claire noticed a loose board in the floor, a draft coming from around the window frame, a pile of mending that had clearly been abandoned due to the arthritis Grant had mentioned. They sat at Eleanor's small table while she fussed with coffee and cake, her movements careful and deliberate, compensating for the pain Claire could see in her gnarled hands. When Eleanor finally sat down, she fixed them both with that sharp gaze and waited. Grant told the story economically: the blizzard, Claire's arrival, the practical decision to marry rather than see her head off into uncertainty. He left out the emotional parts, the children's desperate need, his own reluctant surrender to the necessity of help. But Eleanor seemed to hear what wasn't being said anyway. So you married for convenience, she said, looking at Claire directly. Not for love. Claire met her eyes steadily. I married for survival, and perhaps the chance at something better than I had before. Love is a luxury I couldn't afford. Eleanor smiled, and it transformed her weathered face. Honest, at least. That's good. Too many people start marriages with pretty lies and wonder why they end up strangers. She turned to Grant. And you? Are you done grieving your Sarah, or is this poor girl going to live in a dead woman's shadow? The blunt question made Grant flinch, but he didn't look away. I'll always grieve Sarah, but Claire deserves to be her own person, not a replacement. I know the difference. Do you? Eleanor's voice was gentle but probing. Because knowing and doing are different things, Grant Holloway. Make sure you treat this one right. She's got the look of someone who's survived hard things. Don't make her survival harder. The warning was clear, and Claire felt an unexpected rush of gratitude for this fierce old woman who'd known her for all of 10 minutes and was already defending her. Grant must have felt it too, because his jaw tightened and he nodded solemnly. I'll do right by her, he promised. They spent another hour with Eleanor, and as they talked, Claire's hands moved almost without conscious thought to the pile of mending sitting in the corner. She picked up a shirt, examined the torn seam, and began to repair it with neat, tiny stitches. Eleanor watched with keen interest but said nothing, just kept the conversation flowing while Claire worked through the pile. When they finally stood to leave, Eleanor clasped Claire's hand in both of hers, the grip weak but warm. You're welcome here any time, child. And if he gives you trouble, she nodded toward Grant, you come tell me. I've known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. I can set him straight. I'll remember that, Claire promised, meaning it. On the walk home, Grant was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. Thank you for the mending. She wouldn't have asked, and I wouldn't have thought to offer, but you saw what needed doing and just did it. Partners, Claire reminded him, using his own word. We help where we can. Partners, he agreed, and something in his voice suggested the word was starting to mean more than just a practical arrangement. They arrived home to find a wagon in the yard and a man waiting on the porch, tall and broad, with slicked-back dark hair and clothes too fine for a working farm. He stood as they approached, his smile wide but not reaching his eyes. Grant Holloway, he called out cheerfully, just the man I wanted to see. And this must be the new bride I've been hearing about. Word travels fast in small towns. Claire felt Grant stiffen beside her, his whole body going tense and wary. When he spoke, his voice was cold enough to freeze water. Dent, what do you want? Cyrus Dent. Claire remembered the name from town gossip. whispered warnings about the land grabber who'd forced more than one desperate farmer to sell for pennies on the dollar. Her stomach clenched with instinctive alarm. Now, is that any way to greet a neighbor? Dent's smile never wavered. I just came by to offer my congratulations. Marriage is a sacred institution. Though I must say it was quite sudden, wasn't it? Woman shows up in a blizzard and 3 days later she's Mrs. Holloway. Makes a man wonder. Wonder what exactly? Grant's hand found the small of Claire's back, a protective gesture that Dent's sharp eyes didn't miss. Oh, nothing untoward, just curious about the legalities, that's all. Marriage certificates, property transfers, all those tedious official matters. You did file the proper paperwork, I assume, with a legal witness and everything? The threat beneath the friendly words was unmistakable. Dent was probing for weaknesses, looking for any legal angle he could exploit. Claire felt Grant's hand press more firmly against her back, steadying them both. Reverend Crawford married us yesterday afternoon with Mr. and Mrs. Johansson as witnesses. Certificates filed with the county clerk, and my wife's name is on the deed to this property as joint owner. Everything legal and proper. Unless you're questioning the Reverend's authority? Dent's smile tightened fractionally. Of course not. Just doing my due diligence. I've had my eye on this land for a while now, Grant. It's good farmland, well-positioned. If you ever wanted to sell, I'd make you a fair offer. I'm not selling. Everyone sells eventually. Life has a way of forcing hard decisions. Dent's gaze slid to Claire, assessing and dismissive all at once, especially when circumstances change. A new wife, children to feed, unexpected expenses. Sometimes a clean start somewhere else is the best option. Claire felt anger kindle in her chest, hot and bright. This man was standing on their property, threatening their home, implying that she was somehow a burden that would drive Grant to sell. Before she could think better of it, she stepped forward, moving out from behind Grant's protective hand. "Mr. Dent," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made both men look at her in surprise. "I appreciate your concern for our circumstances, but I assure you we're managing just fine. My husband and I are partners in this farm and in raising our children. We're not going anywhere." Something flickered in Dent's eyes. Surprise, reassessment, perhaps a glimmer of respect. But his smile remained fixed and cold. "Spirited, isn't she? I can see why you married her, Grant. But spirit doesn't pay debts or survive droughts. This land is hard on people, breaks them eventually. And when it breaks you, I'll still be here, ready to take this burden off your hands. Get off my property, off my—" Grant's voice was soft, deadly. "Now." Dent held up his hands in mock surrender. I'm going. Just remember my offer when times get tough. And they will get tough. They always do." He climbed into his wagon, tipped his hat to Claire with exaggerated courtesy. "Mrs. Holloway, a pleasure." They stood together watching him drive away, his wagon leaving deep ruts in the snow. Claire could feel Grant vibrating with suppressed fury beside her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That man," he ground out, "has been circling this farm like a vulture for 2 years. Every time something goes wrong, every time we have a bad harvest or lose livestock, he shows up with his sympathetic face and his reasonable offers. He wants this land, and he won't stop until he gets it, or I'm dead." The raw honesty of it shook Claire. Why does he want it so badly? Water rights? The creek that runs through my property feeds into the main river. Whoever controls this land controls water access for half the farms in the area. Dent could charge whatever he wanted, make himself rich while everyone else struggles. Grant turned to look at her, his expression fierce. "I won't give it to him. This land is my children's inheritance. It's their future. I don't care what he threatens or offers or implies. We're staying." Claire heard the "we" and felt something warm unfold in her chest. Not just him and the children anymore. We. All of them together, facing whatever came. "Then we'll stay," she said simply, "and we'll make sure he never gets a foothold." Grant studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his dark eyes. Not love, not yet, but maybe the beginning of real partnership, the kind built on shared purpose and mutual respect rather than just desperate necessity. "You didn't have to stand up to him," he said quietly. "Could have let me handle it." Partners, Claire reminded him for the second time that day. We face things together. That includes men like Cyrus Dent. The corner of his mouth lifted in something that was almost a smile. Remind me never to get on your bad side. They went inside together, and Claire set about preparing lunch while Grant checked the supplies in the cellar, making lists of what they'd need before spring. The encounter with Dent had shaken them both, but it had also clarified something. This farm, this life, this fragile family they were building, it was worth protecting, worth fighting for. The children came home from school full of chatter and energy, Ben announcing that his friend Tommy wanted to come play sometime, and could he please? Josie was quieter, but she seemed unharmed by whatever gossip had circulated at school, and when Claire asked gently about her day, the girl just shrugged. Miss Warren asked if the stories were true, and I said yes, you married Papa and now you're our mother. She said she was happy for us. Some of the other kids stared, but nobody said anything mean. Not where I could hear, anyway. That was probably the best they could hope for. Claire hugged her and set them both to practicing letters while she made dinner, venison stew with vegetables from the cellar, rich and warming. Grant came in as the sun was setting, his face lined with fatigue, and sank into his chair with a groan that spoke of a long, hard day. They ate together as the darkness pressed close around the house, and Claire found herself watching her new family with a strange sense of wonder. This was her life now. These people, this place, this daily rhythm of work and meals and small conversations about school and chores and neighbors. It wasn't what she dreamed of back in Philadelphia. It was harder, stranger, built on uncertainty rather than romance. But it was hers. After dinner, she pulled out her mending while Grant carved something by lamplight, his hands moving with surprising delicacy for such a big man. The children played a quiet game with pebbles, and for a while the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of Grant's knife against wood. "What are you making?" Claire asked eventually. Grant held up the piece, a small bird, wings spread as though in flight, still rough but recognizable. Something for the children. They like having things to play with. Claire watched his hands shape the wood, gentle and sure, and thought about all the little wooden toys she'd seen lined up on the windowsill. Not just carvings. Love made tangible, a father's way of showing affection when words were too hard. The realization made her throat tight. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He glanced at her, then back at the bird. "It's just wood, nothing special." But it was special, and they both knew it. Claire returned to her mending, and the comfortable silence settled over them again like a blanket. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Claire stood at the window looking out at the star-filled sky. Behind her, she heard Grant moving around, banking the fire, setting out the coffee pot for morning. The domestic sounds of shared life. "Claire," his voice was soft. "Thank you. For today. For standing up to Dent. For visiting Eleanor. For just being here." She turned to find him standing in the middle of the room, the lamplight casting his scarred face into shadow and light. He looked vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. The careful walls lowered just enough to let her glimpse the man beneath. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I'm your wife. This is what partners do." "I know, but—" He stopped, struggled with words. "I haven't been a partner to anyone in 4 years. I forgot how. Forgot what it means to have someone standing beside me instead of behind me or in front of me or gone altogether. It's going to take time for me to remember." The honesty of it broke something open in Claire's chest. "Then we'll learn together, both of us. I don't know how to be a wife or a mother or a farmer any more than you know how to be a partner again. We'll figure it out as we go." Grant nodded slowly, and for just a moment Claire thought he might cross the room, might reach for her hand or offer some small gesture of affection. But the moment passed, and he turned away instead, moving to his own bed. "Good night, Claire." "Good night, Grant." She lay in her bed listening to his breathing across the room and thought about all the ways they were learning each other, building something new from broken pieces. It would take time, maybe years. Maybe it would never become the kind of love story she'd once dreamed of. But lying there in the darkness, with her ring solid on her finger and her family safe under the same roof, Claire thought that maybe, just maybe, this quiet partnership built on honesty and mutual respect might turn into something even better than a dream, something real. The next morning brought new routines and new challenges. The children needed lunches packed for school, and Claire realized she had no idea what provisions they had or what would keep. Grant showed her the cellar, the careful organization of jars and sacks, the precious supplies that had to last until spring. Together they assembled simple meals, bread and cheese, dried apples, a precious cookie each that Ben received with the reverence usually reserved for gold. After the children left, Claire and Grant fell into a working rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. He went out to check the livestock while she cleaned the house, sweeping and scrubbing until everything gleamed. She found herself humming as she worked, an old song her mother used to sing, and realized with a start that she was happy. Not deliriously, romantically happy, but contentedly, purposefully happy. The kind of happiness that came from useful work and belonging. At midday, Grant came in for lunch, and they sat together eating bread and cold meat. He told her about a ewe that was showing signs of coming into labor early, and she told him about finding a leak in the roof above the loft that would need attention. Mundane conversations about mundane problems, but underneath it was the steady building of partnership, of two people learning to work in tandem. "I've been thinking," Grant said as they finished eating, "about what Dent said yesterday, about unexpected expenses and hard times." Claire's stomach tightened. "You're not actually considering selling?" "No, never. But he wasn't entirely wrong about expenses. We're managing, but just barely. One bad harvest, one hard winter, and we could be in real trouble." He met her eyes steadily. "I want to be honest with you about what you've taken on. This farm, this life, it's not secure. There are no guarantees." "There are never guarantees," Claire said. "I learned that when my parents died. When my fiancé abandoned me at a train station. The only thing we can control is how we face the uncertainty." "And how do you want to face it?" Claire thought about the question seriously. "Together. Honestly. Planning as best we can, but accepting that sometimes plans fail. And when they do, we adjust and keep going. Because giving up isn't an option, not when we have children depending on us." Grant's expression softened in a way she was learning to recognize as approval. "Together, then. And honestly, I can work with that." The afternoon passed in separate labors. Grant outside battling the cold and the endless demands of the farm. Claire inside creating order from chaos and learning the geography of her new home. She found treasures tucked away in unexpected places. A box of precious sugar hidden behind flour sacks. A bundle of herbs hanging in the rafters that filled the house with the scent of summer when she brushed them. A small leather-bound book tucked under the bed that turned out to be a ledger where Grant tracked every penny spent and earned. She sat with that ledger for a long time, studying the careful columns of numbers, seeing the story they told. The farm made just enough to sustain them if nothing went wrong. But there was no cushion, no safety net. One disaster, and they'd be at Cyrus Dent's mercy. The knowledge should have frightened her. Instead, it clarified things. They needed to be smart, careful, always planning ahead. And they needed to work together because neither of them could survive this alone. When the children came home, Claire had fresh bread cooling on the table and a pot of soup warming on the stove. Their faces lit up at the sight and smell, and they fell on the food like they'd been starving, which made Claire wonder how many meals had been skipped or skimped in the years before she came. "Tell me about school," she said as they ate. Ben launched into an enthusiastic account of arithmetic lessons while Josie picked at her bread. Her usual brightness dimmed. Claire watched her carefully, noting the tension in the girl's shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the door as though expecting trouble to walk through it. "Josie?" Claire prompted gently. "Everything all right?" The girl's jaw tightened. "Tommy Peterson said his ma told him we're not a real family, that you only married Papa for his land and you'll leave when you get tired of us." Her voice cracked. "I told him he was a liar and his ma didn't know anything, but he just laughed." Claire's chest tightened with fury and hurt on the girl's behalf. Before she could respond, Grant's chair scraped back violently. He'd come in through the back door unnoticed, and his face was thunderous. "Did Tommy say anything else?" His voice was dangerously quiet. Josie shook her head quickly. "I didn't let him. I told him if he said one more word, I'd bloody his nose like I did to Jacob last week, and Miss Warren was watching, so he shut up." "Good girl." Grant's approval was fierce. Then he looked at Claire, something raw and almost apologetic in his expression. This is what I was afraid of. The gossip, the judgment. It's going to follow us for months, maybe years. Claire stood and crossed to where Josie sat, kneeling beside the girl's chair and taking her cold hands. Listen to me, sweetheart. People will always talk. It's what they do when their own lives are too small and boring. But talking doesn't change the truth. I married your father because I wanted a home and a family, and he needed a partner. That's honest and real. What Tommy Peterson's mother thinks about it doesn't matter one bit. But what if they're mean to Ben? Josie's eyes filled with tears. He's little. He doesn't understand why people are being cruel. Then you protect him, like you always have. And when you get home, you tell us what happened, and we'll help you figure out how to handle it. Claire squeezed her hands. You're not alone in this anymore, Josie. You've got me and your father. We're a family, and families stand together. The girl threw her arms around Claire's neck, sobbing with the release of tension she'd been carrying. Claire held her, stroking her hair and murmuring comfort, while Grant watched with an expression that suggested he was witnessing something both precious and painful. That night, after the children were asleep, Grant stood at the window staring out into the darkness. Claire could feel the weight of his thoughts from across the room. I should have protected them better, he said finally. Should have thought about how this would affect them before I dragged you into it. You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose this. Claire set down her mending and moved to stand beside him. And you can't protect children from the whole world, Grant. All you can do is give them the tools to face it and the knowledge that they're loved enough to come home to. He turned to look at her, and in the dim lamplight his scarred face looked younger, more vulnerable. You're good with them. Better than I expected. Better than I deserve. They're easy to love, Claire said simply. They're brave and smart and kind even after everything they've lost. That's your doing. You raised them well. Sarah raised them. I just kept them alive after she was gone. There it was again, the ghost between them, the woman whose shadow stretched long across this house and this family. Claire knew she should let it go, should accept that Grant's grief was his own business. But standing there in the quiet darkness, she found herself speaking anyway. Tell me about her. About Sarah. Grant's whole body went rigid. Why? Because she was important to you. Because the children loved her and miss her. Because if I'm going to be part of this family, I should know who came before me. Claire kept her voice gentle. I'm not trying to replace her, Grant. I just want to understand. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he began to speak. She was from Virginia, educated, refined, everything I wasn't. Her family had money, connections. She could have married anyone. But she chose me, God knows why. His voice was distant, remembering. She was brave, came west with nothing but a carpetbag and dreams about building something new. This house was half the size then, barely more than a shack. She never complained, just rolled up her sleeves and made it home. She sounds remarkable. She was. She was also stubborn as hell, terrible at cooking, and sang off key loud enough to scare the chickens. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. She loved the children fiercely. Used to tell them stories every night, made up tales about brave knights and clever princesses. Josie has her determination. Ben has her joy. Claire heard the love in his voice, raw and real, even after 4 years. It didn't hurt the way she might have expected. Instead, it told her something important about the man she'd married. He was capable of deep, lasting love. He'd given it once completely. Whether he could ever give it again remained to be seen. When she died, Grant continued, his voice rougher now, it broke something in me. I was so angry. Angry at God, at fate, at her for leaving me. I blamed Ben for a long time. An innocent baby, and I blamed him. He turned to face Claire fully, his eyes haunted. It took me almost a year to even hold him without feeling that rage. By then, I'd missed so much. His first smile, his first word. Sarah would have hated what I became. But you came back from it, Claire said firmly. You learned to love him. You're raising both children with everything you have. That's what matters. Is it? Because some days I look at them and all I see is what I'm failing to give them. A real home. A mother who's there by choice, not obligation. A father who isn't half dead inside. Claire reached out and took his hand, the gesture surprising them both. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid. You gave them me. That counts for something. And you're not half dead, Grant. You're just wounded. There's a difference. He stared down at their joined hands, and Claire saw him struggle with something. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I'm afraid. Of what? Of starting to care again. Of letting you matter, letting this matter, and then losing it all over again. I don't think I could survive that twice. The raw honesty of it broke Claire's heart. She squeezed his hand tighter. I can't promise you won't lose things. None of us can promise that. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere by choice. I meant my vows, Grant, for better or worse. That includes the scary parts. He lifted their joined hands and looked at them in the lamplight, her small pale fingers wrapped in his larger, darker ones. I'll try, he said finally. To be a real partner. To let this be more than just an arrangement. But I'm going to be terrible at it, fair warning. Then we'll be terrible at it together. Claire smiled despite the seriousness of the moment. I'm not exactly an expert at partnership either. He huffed a quiet laugh, and the sound warmed something in Claire's chest. This was progress. Slow and painful and honest, but progress nonetheless. She released his hand and returned to her mending, and they finished the evening in comfortable silence, two wounded people learning to exist in the same space without armor. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for chores and breakfast, getting the children ready for school. Days were for work. Grant outside battling the endless demands of the farm. Claire inside creating order and comfort. Evenings were for family, for shared meals and quiet conversation, and the small intimacies of people learning to live together. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. Grant started leaving Claire a cup of coffee on the table each morning, already sweetened the way she liked. She started mending his clothes before he even noticed they needed it, leaving them folded on his bed. The children gravitated to her naturally now, bringing their small problems and victories to her as easily as they did to their father. 1 week passed, then 2. Winter deepened, bringing bitter cold and heavy snows that kept them close to home. The isolation should have been oppressive. Instead, Claire found it oddly freeing. Here, away from town and gossip, they could just be themselves. No pretense, no performance, just a family figuring out how to exist together. It was during the 3rd week, on a particularly brutal morning when the wind screamed around the house like something alive, that disaster struck. Claire woke to Ben's crying, a desperate, frightened sound that sent her heart into her throat. She rushed to the loft ladder and found Josie crouched beside her brother, her face white with fear. He's burning up, Josie said, her voice shaking. I can't wake him properly. He just moans and says he's cold even though he's hot as fire. Claire climbed into the loft and pressed her hand to Ben's forehead. The child was indeed burning with fever, his skin dry and flushed, his eyes glassy when they fluttered open. Terror gripped her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Grant, she called down. Grant, I need you. He was up the ladder in seconds, taking in the situation with one sweep of his eyes. His face went pale, and Claire saw the naked fear there, the memory of another sickness, another desperate fight against death. Not again, he whispered. God, please not again. Focus. Claire's voice cracked like a whip, pulling him back from the edge of panic. We need cool water and clean cloths. And check if we have any willow bark. Josie, get dressed and stay warm. Your father's going to need your help. The authority in her voice steadied them all. Grant climbed down and moved mechanically, gathering what she'd asked for. Claire carefully lifted Ben and carried him down the ladder, laying him on her own bed where she could tend him properly. The boy whimpered, reaching for her with hot, seeking hands. Mama, I'm so cold. Why am I so cold? Hush, sweetheart. I've got you. Claire began sponging his face and arms with cool water, working to bring down the fever. You're going to be fine. I'm right here. Grant returned with willow bark and warm water. Together they mixed a tea and coaxed Ben to drink it, though he fought them weakly, wanting only to sleep. Josie hovered nearby, her face streaked with tears. Is he going to die like Mama? She whispered. No. Claire said it with absolute conviction, as though saying it firmly enough could make it true. He's going to be fine. It's just a fever. We'll get it down. But as the morning wore on and Ben's fever climbed higher, despite their efforts, Claire's certainty began to waver. The child was so small, so fragile. She could feel his life flickering like a candle flame in a strong wind, threatening to gut her out. Grant sat on the floor beside the bed, his head in his hands, and Claire could hear him praying under his breath. Desperate, broken prayers for mercy, for another chance, for the life of his son. The sound of his desperation cut her deeper than any knife. "Grant," she touched his shoulder gently. "I need you to go to town, find Doc Morris, bring him back here." "The storm? I know, but Ben needs more help than we can give him. Please." He looked up at her with eyes full of the same terror she'd seen that first night in the blizzard. The fear of a man who'd already lost too much and couldn't survive losing more. But he nodded and stood, pulling on his coat with mechanical movements. "If anything happens while I'm gone, nothing's going to happen." Claire kept her voice steady, strong. "Go, fast as you can. We'll be here when you get back." He paused at the door, looking back at her and Ben and Josie huddled by the bed. "Claire, thank you for being here, for not running." Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him, leaving Claire alone with two frightened children and a responsibility so heavy it threatened to crush her. She returned to Ben's side and continued her vigil, sponging his burning skin, murmuring comfort, willing him to fight. Josie crawled onto the bed beside her brother and took his hand. "Remember when Mama used to sing to us when we were sick?" she said softly. "She said music could chase away the bad things." "What did she sing?" Claire asked. "Shenandoah." It was her favorite. Claire didn't know all the words, but she knew the melody. She began to sing softly, her voice cracking with emotion and fear, but carrying the tune. Josie joined in, and together they filled the small house with sound, a lullaby for a sick child, a prayer set to music, an act of desperate hope. Ben's eyelids fluttered. His hand squeezed Josie's weakly, and his fever, which had been climbing relentlessly all morning, seemed to pause. Not dropping yet, but at least not rising. They sang every song they could remember, taking turns when their voices gave out, filling the hours of Grant's absence with music and prayer and stubborn refusal to give up. And slowly, so slowly Claire almost missed it, Ben's fever began to break. His skin cooled fractionally, his breathing eased. The deadly flush faded from his cheeks. By the time Grant returned with Doc Morris in tow, both men half frozen from the brutal ride, Ben was sleeping peacefully, his fever down to a manageable warmth, his color almost normal. Doc Morris examined him thoroughly while they all held their breath. Finally, he straightened and smiled. "Crisis has passed. Looks like you two did everything right. Another few hours, and I might have been worried, but he's through the worst of it now." The relief that flooded through Claire made her knees buckle. Grant caught her, his strong hand steadying her, and she leaned into him without thinking, letting him take her weight. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other up, while Josie cried happy tears and Doc Morris packed up his bag. "You'll want to watch him for the next day or so," the doctor said. "Keep him warm, give him plenty to drink. But barring any setbacks, he should be up and causing trouble in a few days." After Doc Morris left, refusing payment with a wave of his hand and promising to check back in a few days, the house fell quiet. Grant sent Josie to the loft to rest, then turned to Claire with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You saved him," he said simply. "We saved him, together." "No, I was useless, frozen with fear. You took charge. You knew what to do. You kept Josie calm and stayed strong when I couldn't." His voice was rough with emotion. "Sarah would have been proud of you. I know I am." The comparison to his dead wife should have stung. Instead, Claire heard it for what it was, the highest compliment he knew how to give. She touched his hand lightly. "We're partners, remember? When one of us can't be strong, the other holds us up. Today it was my turn. Tomorrow it might be yours." He looked at their hands where they touched, then back at her face. "Claire, I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. "All right." "These past few weeks, living with you, watching you become part of this family, it's been changing something in me. I'm not good at this, at feelings and words and all the things I should probably say, but I want you to know." He paused, struggling. I want you to know that this doesn't feel like an arrangement anymore. It feels real. You feel real. And I... He stopped, took a breath, tried again. I'm starting to care about you. More than I planned to. More than I thought I could. The confession hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying for them both. Claire felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of this moment, this man, this impossible family they'd built from nothing. I care about you too, she whispered. About all of you. This is my home now. My real home. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be. Grant reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his work-roughened hand. His thumb brushed her cheek gently, and Claire leaned into the touch, her eyes drifting closed. She felt him lean closer, felt his breath warm on her face. The kiss, when it came, was gentle and careful and sweet. Not the passionate embrace of romance novels, but something better. The tentative first touch of two wounded people learning to trust again, learning to hope. His lips were soft against hers, and she tasted coffee and promise and the beginning of something that might, someday, become love. When they pulled apart, they stayed close, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air. I'm still scared, Grant admitted quietly. Me too, Claire said, but we'll be scared together. He smiled, a real smile, not the ghost of one, and it transformed his face, making him look years younger. Together, he agreed. A week later, spring began to show its first tentative signs. The worst of winter was breaking, and with it came the thaw in other ways too. Ben recovered fully, bouncing around the house with renewed energy. The children went back to school, and the gossip about Claire's sudden marriage began to fade into just another piece of town history. But Cyrus Dent hadn't forgotten. He appeared again one afternoon in early March, his wagon rumbling into the yard just as Claire was hanging laundry. This time, though, he wasn't alone. 3 men rode with him, hard-faced and carrying an official-looking document. Grant was in the barn when they arrived, but he heard the commotion and came out quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the axe he'd been using. Claire moved to his side without thinking, presenting a united front. Dent, Grant said coldly, I told you to stay off my property. Now, is that any way to talk to the man who's about to save you from ruin? Dent's smile was shark-like. I've been doing some research, Grant, looking into property records, and I found something very interesting. He unfolded the document with a flourish. It seems there was a lien filed against this property 3 years ago. Back taxes, unpaid. With interest and penalties, it's grown quite substantial. The county's ready to foreclose, and I've offered to purchase the debt. He looked at them with false sympathy. Which means, legally, I now own this farm unless you can pay what's owed, and I'm guessing you can't. Claire felt Grant go rigid beside her. How much? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. $300. Due immediately, or I file for possession. $300. It might as well have been $3,000. Claire knew from the ledger that they had perhaps $40 in savings. Even if they sold every last possession, they'd never raise that much. Dent saw the knowledge in their faces and smiled wider. Of course, I'm a reasonable man. You could work off the debt, become tenants on your own land. I'd only take 70% of your harvest each year, fair terms under the circumstances. Like hell, the words came from Claire, surprising everyone. She stepped forward, her chin lifted. You're lying about that lien. Back taxes get paid from harvest sales every year. Grant's never missed a payment. Can you prove that? Dent's eyes glittered. Because I have official records that say otherwise. And I have receipts. Grant's voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath. Every payment dated and signed by the tax collector. They're filed at the county office. For the first time, Dent's smile faltered. The county office burned down last year. Those records are gone. The county office burned, Grant agreed, but I keep copies, filed safe in my desk. He gestured toward the house. Would you like to see them? Or should we ride to town together and sort this out with the sheriff? The color drained from Dent's face. Behind him, his men shifted uncomfortably, clearly not eager to be part of whatever scheme their employer had cooked up. Claire watched the man's confidence crumble and felt fierce satisfaction. Those receipts could be forged, Dent tried weakly. So could your lien. Grant stepped forward, and there was something dangerous in his posture. Here's what's going to happen, Dent. You and your men are going to get off my property. Then you're going to withdraw that fraudulent lien. And if you ever come back here, if you ever threaten my family or my land again, I'll make sure everyone in the territory knows exactly what kind of man you are. The kind who forges documents and steals from widowers. You can't prove, can't I? Because I've got a feeling if the sheriff looks closely at your document, he'll find some interesting discrepancies, and I've got witnesses now. Grant's hand found Claire's. My wife, my neighbors, people who know I've paid my debts honestly. Your word against all of ours. How do you think that'll play? The standoff stretched taut as wire. Then Dent's shoulders sagged, and Claire knew they'd won. He climbed back into his wagon with as much dignity as he could muster, his men following quickly. This isn't over, he tried one last time. Yes, Grant said firmly. It is. They watched the wagon disappear down the road, and only when it was gone did Claire allow herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking with residual fear and fury. Did you really keep copies of all those receipts? She asked. Grant's mouth twitched. I keep copies of everything. Sarah taught me that. Said you could never be too careful with legal matters. Claire started laughing, the sound breaking loose from her chest like something that had been held too long. Grant joined her, and they stood in the yard laughing together while the first green shoots of spring pushed through the melting snow, and the threat that had hung over them for years finally dispersed like morning fog. That evening, as they sat around the table after dinner, Grant cleared his throat. I've been thinking, he began, about what makes a home, what makes a family. Josie and Ben looked up from their slates, curious. Claire set down her mending, giving him her full attention. When Sarah died, I thought home died with her. Thought family was just going through motions, keeping us all fed and housed and breathing, but not really living. He looked at each of them in turn. I was wrong. Home isn't a place or even a person. It's the people who choose to stand together no matter what comes. And family is what we build with our choices and our courage and our willingness to care even when caring hurts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small wooden birds, perfectly carved, wings spread in flight. He set one in front of Josie and one in front of Ben. These are for you, to remember that home is where you're brave enough to land, even when you've been flying scared for a long time. The children clutched their birds with reverent wonder. Then Grant pulled out a third object, another bird, but this one was different, unfinished, rough in places, as though he'd made it in a hurry or with uncertain hands. He held it out to Claire. This one's for you. I know it's not much and it's not finished because I'm still figuring out how to make it right, but I wanted you to have it anyway, to know that you've given us all a place to land. Claire took the wooden bird with trembling hands. It was imperfect and rough, and the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. Thank you, she whispered. I'll treasure it. I have something too. She stood and moved to her carpet bag, pulling out the faded cotton apron she'd found carefully folded in the bottom. It had belonged to Sarah. She'd found it weeks ago and kept it, uncertain what to do with it. Now she knew. She brought it to Grant and held it out. I can't replace what you lost. I won't even try. But I can honor it. This was hers, and it should stay in the family. I thought maybe... She paused, emotion making her voice thick. Maybe Josie could have it. Something to remember her mother by. To know where she came from. Grant stared at the apron, and Claire saw his eyes fill with tears for the first time. He took it carefully, reverently, then held it out to Josie. The girl accepted it with shaking hands, pressing it to her face and breathing in the faint scent that still clung to the fabric. Thank you, Grant said to Claire, his voice rough, for understanding, for knowing that loving what came before doesn't mean you can't build something new. Claire moved to him and in front of the children wrapped her arms around him. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, and they stood like that while Josie and Ben watched with wide, wondering eyes. Are you crying, Papa? Ben asked, his voice small and uncertain. Grant pulled back and looked at his son, unashamed of the tears on his face. Yes, son. Sometimes you cry because you're sad, And sometimes you cry because you're grateful. Right now, I'm grateful for all of you, for this family we're building together. Ben launched himself at them, wrapping his small arms around both their legs. Josie joined in, and they stood in the center of the small house in a tangled embrace. Four people who'd been broken in different ways, learning that broken things could still make something whole when fitted together. Right. As spring advanced, bringing green to the fields and warmth to the air, Claire stood on the porch one morning watching Grant work while the children played nearby. She'd hung her wooden bird on a nail beside the door, and it swayed gently in the breeze, its rough wings catching the light. This wasn't the life she'd imagined back in Philadelphia. It was harder, stranger, built on honesty instead of romance. But watching her husband straighten from his work and smile at her across the yard, watching her children laugh as they chased each other through the emerging grass, Claire knew with absolute certainty that this was better than any dream. She'd come west on a stranger's promise and found it empty. But in that emptiness, she'd discovered something far more valuable. A family who needed her, a man learning to love again, children who called her mama with absolute faith. She'd found a home not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd been brave enough to build it from broken pieces and desperate hope. Grant crossed the yard and climbed the porch steps, pulling her into his arms in full view of anyone who might be watching. He kissed her thoroughly, deeply, the kind of kiss that spoke of hard-won trust and growing affection and the promise of more to come. "Love you," he murmured against her lips, still figuring out how to say it right, but I do. "Love you." "I love you too," Claire whispered back. "All of you. This whole impossible, beautiful life." The wooden birds swayed on the porch beam, their rough wings catching the light like a benediction. And inside the small house that had once been just shelter but was now truly home, everything they needed was waiting, warmth and safety, and the kind of love that grew slow and deep and true, built on partnership and honesty and the courage to choose each other every single day. This was where Claire belonged, not because fate had brought her here or because she'd had no other choice, but because she'd chosen it, chosen them, chosen to build something real from the ashes of broken dreams. And every morning when she woke to coffee already waiting and Grant's quiet presence and children who called her mama without hesitation, Claire knew that sometimes the best things in life weren't the ones you planned for. They were the ones you were brave enough to claim when they appeared unexpectedly in a blizzard, offering nothing but honesty and hard work and the chance at something true. She'd come west looking for a fairy tale and found something better instead, a real life with all its imperfections and struggles and hard-won joy. And she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.